Hi, welcome. I just wanted to make a little announcement because several people have asked me, how do I choose between the two sessions during the breakout? And is there going to be a video of the other session? The answer is yes. And we wish we could do a longer program, but you won't have to miss anything. A couple of weeks, a little bit after the summit, we will get these videos up and you can see what you missed. So don't feel deprived. Pick either one. You will get to see it. Anyway, let's get started. I'm very excited to introduce David Huseby. He's the security maven for Hyperledger. This is a big blockchain project, and this is the latest magical word, right, in healthcare? Blockchain. What's blockchain going to do? So we're going to get to talk to him, and just to make sure that the questions for people who know very little about blockchain and technology are answered, I'm going to do the interviewing instead of our Chief Technology Officer, Adrian, to make sure that it's really, that we really start from the base and move up to more technical things. So let's get started.
How close do I have to be? Oh,
yeah. So do you want to say a few things about yourself and Hyperledger first?
Sure, yeah. So as she introduced, I'm the security maven, which means that it's my job to coach all of the open source projects at Hyperledger on how to do open source software correctly. That's sort of the general term. I have a long background in security and privacy. I previously worked at Mozilla, and then I worked at Linden Lab, and I've done work in aerospace and gaming, all kinds of stuff. So all of it's been mostly geared towards platform security is sort of the general term. Okay. Hyperledger is an industry group that's hosted by the Linux Foundation. It was created to fulfill the need of cross-industry cooperation for blockchain technology. And the reason it's at the Linux Foundation is Linux Foundation's mission is to build foundational technologies that are used for things like little things like the internet. So the Linux Foundation has the Linux kernel project, and they have the Apache web server project, and OpenSSL, and lots of foundational technologies that are used in all of the electronic systems that we have today.
Can I ask one really dumb question?
There's no dumb question.
Why is open source so important to you? It sounds like that's mainly where you've worked.
Yeah. So
or maybe what is open source?
Yeah, let's start there.
Really basic. Okay.
Let's start there. So open source software is sort of the counterpart to commercial software in the sense that it's software that's developed in an open and transparent way. It's an open community. Anybody is invited to participate. It's a spontaneous cooperation to build some piece of software. So Firefox is an open source web browser. So back when Firefox started, when Netscape open sourced their browser, they released the source code to Netscape. And almost immediately, the Mozilla Foundation was created, and a whole bunch of developers all over the world, and translators and artists, and it's a really beautiful community, just people from all walks of life, said, hey, we all like these web browser things, let's make the best one. And let's make one that can be owned by the people almost, right? And they all collaborated and coordinated and built the Firefox web browser, and it's still a beautiful browser today. So open source is used to just leverage everybody's individual talents and their motivation to build tools that we all can agree are, good and work, right? They're not free from security problems, far from it, but the theory is that the more people you have looking at something, the fewer errors there are, right? And so this is why almost every foundational technology that requires trust is an open source piece of software. So the Linux kernel runs basically all of the servers on the internet because everybody has to trust the servers on the internet. So they want to know that it's running an operating system that hundreds of thousands of people have looked at, and it's trustworthy. The Apache web server is a good example. MySQL database is a good example. And very specifically, just to kind of head us back in the direction of blockchain, in fact, every piece of encryption software is open source. And the general rule is that if you can't see the source code for encryption, you can't trust it. So the thing you're trusting to keep your data secret is a piece of software that is almost certainly open source.
And that means that millions of people will be looking at it.
Yeah, or that it's completely auditable, right?
Yes.
And there are regulatory issues about this too. So like if you want to claim safe harbor, you can say, look, no, it's open source, it's been audited, all that kind of stuff. It's not some piece of software that we incorrectly implemented and that's why our clients all lost their whatever, right? Like open source has many, many utilities, both in legal, regulatory, and just general trust.
So it's good stuff.
Yeah, it's really great stuff. And it's actually fun. I mean, pretty much all of my friends that I know all over the world I've met through open source projects. So you want to be a cool kid, get involved. Because I can go to Paris and I have a half a dozen friends that are like, hey, you're in town, let's go drinking. You know, like if you want to be one of those people that just has friends all over the world, open source is how you do it.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
It made me a cool kid. Well, in my mind.
you're-
In my mind, it made me a
Dave-
cool kid.
You're cool. You're cool.
All my friends were like, nerd.
Okay. So now that you've explained open source,
Yeah,
here's your big question.
sure.
What's blockchain? What does it do? What doesn't it do? Let's start there, and then we'll get into how it applies to healthcare. How about that?
Sure.
Okay.
So,
Because it's a magic word. You have to
I
really,
realize.
you have to get really basic.
I realize.
Really
It sounds like it came from a Harry Potter novel, actually. So, blockchains are a new way of storing data. Think of them as similar to a database. But the data is organized in a way that as more data is added, the data that was added previously becomes more and more secure, because to modify that data that had been recorded previously, you would effectively have to rewrite all the data that has been added since then. Okay? And so you can think of them as write only. I don't know if that's too far of a computer science term for you guys, but write only meaning you can only append data to a data structure or to the blockchain, but you can't ever go back and delete it. You can't ever go back and rewrite it or change it. You can only just continually add to it. So that's
So
what a
it's-
blockchain is.
It's immutable.
It's immutable, yeah.
And it's a ledger. That's
Yeah,
why you call
yes.
it hyperledger.
Well, yeah, they call them ledgers because they're very similar to how a bank handles transactions. They never delete old transactions. They just say, well, $100 went into your account, now $100 went out of your account, and then, it's a continuous ledger of all of the transactions that happen at a bank. So that's where you're getting all these terms. Like it's a ledger, there's transactions. The blockchain itself is just how computers themselves store those transactions. And they're stored in such a way as to give end-to-end integrity. So if anything ever changes, you can immediately spot it, right? And you can continually, anybody can look at it and go, yep, all the data in this blockchain is correct. It has not changed since it has been written to this blockchain, okay? And that is one of the first key pieces where we can start building trust on the data itself, which then leads to the other problem that it solves, which is called distributed consensus. Now, distributed consensus is what it says. This is not a fancy term. It's how do 5 people come to an agreement about something, right? The New York Yankees are the best baseball team ever. Let's all just agree on that right now. We can do a distributed consensus. Right, I'm in DC now, aren't I?
Yes.
You can boo me, it's okay.
Different team.
But it's exactly what they mean when they say distributed consensus. It's a bunch of parties coming together and coming to a conclusion. And that conclusion is that the data in the blockchain is correct. Okay, that's all it is. Hopefully that dispels some of this. It's when you start talking about applications of blockchain that you start getting into like esoteric stuff. So there are 2 different ways that consensus is met in these networks of participants. One is called proof of work, which is Bitcoin, okay. And related cryptocurrencies. I can solve a math problem faster than you, and because I solved it first, I get to make the next block in the blockchain. And that math problem is the throttle on how fast blocks are created and which transactions get into blocks and all that stuff. The other way is proof of stake, which is more in a line with the rest of the world because it requires all participants in the network to be known or to be permissioned is what the word is. They call them permissioned networks. And you can think of this as like, let's say the PTA at your school.
Okay.
The board members of the PTA are permissioned. They were elected or they volunteered or whatever, and they are entrusted with making the decisions for the Parent Teachers Association and helping out with the teachers and all this stuff. So when they come to a consensus, they are permissioned representatives for all the parents who come to a consensus that, yes, we're going to do end of the year gifts for all of the teachers. Okay, so most of the world uses permissioned networks, and blockchains are being applied to that segment just as much as they are for cryptocurrencies, because like proof of work in Bitcoin is a very narrow application. It's just currency. And basically every other system we have relies on some credentialing, some permissioned network, right? All the banks in the SWIFT network that clear their books at the end of the day, they're all FDIC regulated institutions, so they're permissioned to be on that network. They could use a permissioned blockchain to clear their books at the end of the day. In fact, there are a lot of pilot projects to look into this. When you're talking about healthcare, you have credentialed physicians, and you have regulated insurance industry, insurance companies, and they could participate in an EHR system that uses blockchains to back up not necessarily the storage of patient data, but the transactions related to patient data. So, and that's just sort of steer us back into, so that we're on topic here. Yeah, so I hope everybody in here is going to go, yeah, I think I get it now.
Not yet.
Not yet? Okay, what's the next question?
Okay. Well, there's a lot of hype about blockchain, like that it can create security and privacy. But is that true? Privacy being defined as your ability in healthcare to keep something private.
Yeah. So we're gonna
as opposed to security breaches, that kind of thing.
Sure. So that is a function of the application of blockchain.
Okay.
And I should point out that Hyperledger is not in the business of application development.
Okay.
We're in the business of building the tools that make blockchains a utility, something that you can deploy. It's a foundational technology. It's the bricks you build your house from, right? That's what Hyperledger is focused on. But we can get into the application stuff, and we should.
Okay.
Before we go there, though, I wanted to make one last point, which is the reason why everybody's talking about blockchain now is because it's a solution to one of the last computer science, like big computer science problems.
Okay.
When computers became a thing back in the 50s and 60s, there were a whole bunch of problems that had to be solved, like how do you store data in a computer? How do you sort data in a computer? There are countless numbers of mathematicians and computer scientists who wrote their PhDs on just how to sort data faster, right? And then it became, how do you store it at large scale, like big databases? And that dominated the computer industry through the 80s and 90s, and we got big companies like Oracle out of this. So these were huge problems that computers could be used to solve. And there was this one persistent problem that nobody had ever solved, and people have been working on it for decades, which was how do you create distributed trust when the people participating in the network could be adversarial? How do you do distributed consensus? Okay, and there's this anonymous person who goes by the name of Satoshi Nakamoto, wrote this paper back in 2008 that said, hey, if you stack these things that we already know, how to do a proof of work, how to do hashing, how do you do all this stuff, you can build a system where everybody's adversarial and you can still get distributed consensus. And then when that happened, everybody went, wow. Okay, now let's look at the computer science behind this and figure out how consensus is created in this system. And now we have these systems that have moved on. Like we have all of these applications. So it solves this last big problem. And there's basically anytime you have an industry where you have people who have to cooperate and they have to all agree on the state of the world, you can apply blockchain to that. You can apply a distributed ledger to that. And that's why this is all you're hearing about, because it's the last big problem. We all have databases, we all have web servers, we all have browsers, we can all store huge amounts of data, we can all back it up, we can encrypt it, we can sort it. But now we all have to agree that it's correct. And we all have, or not correct, but it has integrity, that it hasn't been modified.
So it's really good for knowing that the data are not altered, but it doesn't reveal the data.
Well, this is now you're venturing into applications. Okay. So
Okay.
you asked me if it could be used to protect patient privacy and security. The answer is yes. The application of it could be. There are a number of groups that are working on this. They're starting with the identity problem, mainly.
Oh, yeah, please talk about that, and use of blockchain for identity. It's
So
supposed to help with that, right?
yes, because you can create a distributed consensus that tracks all of the transactions that would be related to any credentialing.
Like an MD or an RN?
Or I was born,
I was born? Okay.
right?
There
I
are
was born-
debates about that,
Yeah.
don't forget.
Or that I live in Nevada, or that
Okay.
I'm from Las Vegas, by the way.
Waving at Stacy, yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, you can build a system where you can do computational proofs that are cryptographically sound, so meaning you can trust that no human has messed with it or no computer has messed with it, to do automatic credentialing. So the DEA does this with physicians who are allowed to prescribe controlled substances. There's a database, you can say, here's their DEA number, is this person credentialed to do that? That works because we all trust the DEA in this regard.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the system we've set up.
Yeah.
But if you apply blockchain to this, then we can have public utilities that are run by nonprofits that can prove that, yes, I'm an American citizen, or yes, I'm a credentialed physician, or yes, I'm over 21 and can buy alcohol. And it can be an automatic thing. That's why people are really excited about this, because I could have a smartphone
Yeah.
that I flash at the bartender, and he scans it with his smartphone, and it comes back with a big thumbs up and
You're over 18.
yay, you're over 21, you can buy the alcohol here, right? And because we trust this distributed consensus and that it's backed up by real records and all that stuff, yeah, that's a proof that I'm over 21 that they can trust, okay? And one of the neat things about this is if we design the regulatory framework correctly, that could then provide that bartender a safe harbor. Because if we all agree as a society that we're going to trust these systems, then the bartender can go, well, I just saw the green check mark, right? Like, that's all I'm ever required to verify. And so I'm not liable for that person. It's their bad decisions. This is getting into law, and I am not an expert about this at all, so take that with a grain of salt. I'm not a lawyer. But there are a lot of advantages to these systems because it creates a distributed trust framework and transitive trust. Yeah. One of the neat things, so what I was getting at here just a second ago is that in terms of privacy, we can build systems, like blockchains could be used as like the most horrible surveillance system in the world. It can be an immutable record of everything you've ever done. It's 1984 on steroids, okay? We don't want to build that. So if you ever hear anybody saying, I'm just going to record everything in the blockchain, just shake your head and just walk away. Just like, no, that's not right. It's not how you do that. But it can serve as an immutable record of manipulation and access to data.
So we could have accountability
So that you can have
and
transparency.
Who's been in your record?
Yes. So I'm very new to the healthcare industry. I don't really know how it works, but I would assume that if I sign a disclosure form at a hospital, that I'm also allowing anybody at the hospital to access my medical records. I'm just assuming that's true. I don't know that's true, but maybe it is, maybe it isn't.
Pretty close to true. Some hospitals have role-based.
Okay.
But they don't have it to where it's just your physician, and then whoever your physician writes, whoever fills the orders or
Okay.
does the procedures that your physician orders, then they get to see your record.
Okay.
So right now so maybe blockchain would enable that kind of protection from the other 9,975 out of 10,000 people that work there. only the ones that are, maybe it could enable only the ones that are working with
Well-
you to help you, the ones that are treating you would be the ones that would see you? Is that possible?
Well, the access piece is an application, but I would say that my ignorance of
Okay.
how my records are handled
Okay.
is directly a result of not having a blockchain that I can look at. So if we were to deploy this where all access to my data, all additions to my data were recorded in a way that I can audit them, then I wouldn't be so ignorant, because I would, next time I go to the hospital for any reason, I would go, just because I'm curious, I'm naturally curious about this stuff, I would go and see, like, oh, okay, this physician looked at it, this, this is what happened to all my data. Here were the records that were added, here were the records that were changed, just to see. And I would be a lot more informed as to what data they have on me and how it's handled.
That's what we thought. That's why we worked in the last major electronic record reform, high-tech, to try to get the right to accountability and transparency
Yeah.
into it, and we were supposed to be able to get just what you're talking about, an accounting for all disclosures from all the different hospital data sets. But the regs have never been written,
Huh.
so we don't have it yet.
So it's politics.
So good luck.
Big surprise.
Yeah. It's politics. Yeah, I think it's politics.
So I want to make one point, touch on something earlier when they were talking about the GDPR and compliance. One of the panel members here said, what we really need is like a really great, like immutable way of recording all the accesses to the data. And if anybody requests to have data deleted, have a record that cannot be deleted, like once we've recorded it, that will always be there that they had requested that it was deleted. And then when it's deleted, we can record that. And I was sitting there thinking, yeah, it'd be funny. Like, what kind of technology would solve this immutable record of the access and management of patient data? And this is why GDPR comes up all of the time. Almost in every meeting I'm in, we're talking about compliance and how it can be applied for this. But just to get back to privacy, I'm actually going to take my Hyperledger hat off for now, because on a personal note, I came from Mozilla, where I worked on web surveillance and web privacy. And prior to that, I worked on Second Life at Linden Lab, where we did a lot of privacy-related things, because it's people of all walks of life are there, and we did all kinds of privacy protections for people.
What kind?
Just like
Just
allowing
don't
them
know
to.
Linden
It's Facebook stuff. So it's a big virtual world. Second Life, if you don't know about it. And there are adult-oriented subcultures in Second Life, and who are very, very keen on maintaining privacy, because they literally were second lives. People who live one life in the real world then go and pretend to be somebody else in a second life in this virtual world.
Okay.
And so that's when I really got into privacy. It was about 10 years ago.
Okay.
But we've been fighting this fight for a decade, and listening to everybody here, I just kept thinking that when we were finding solutions to defend people's privacy, we ultimately came down to the fact that this is an information theory problem. This is a math problem. It's not a regulatory problem. It's not a legal problem. It is legitimately a math problem. Total data sovereignty and embargoing personal data is mathematically impossible, because you would have to be completely isolated from society to maintain airtight privacy. At some point, you have to go and tell a doctor that my tooth aches, or a dentist my tooth aches. At some point, you have to tell somebody else that you think they're cute, right? Like, at some point, you have to talk to other people, you have to convey information. And that information, if observed by third parties, can be used to correlate things about you.
Of course.
Right. It's just like, if I go to Target and I buy car seat covers for a truck, the fact that I bought car seat covers for a truck, Target can make the assumption that I own a truck, right? It's a correlation because why would I buy car seat covers for a truck if I didn't own one, or if I wasn't riding in one, or whatever, right? So just by having a third-party observation of some action, you can infer, I guess, other things to be true about a person.
Yeah.
And on the web and on the internet, they're super good at this. It's in real time, and it only takes a few bits of data to uniquely identify you and uniquely track you across every web page you go to. And so when we were modeling how to fix this problem, we realized it was a math problem, and that the only way to do this is to slow down the data that gets released and to make sure that the data is not precise. And what I mean by that is you would have to disclose data that was not unique to you, but was something unique to, say, the class of people you are in. So let me see if I can explain this better. So if what this gets into is aligning technology with people's reasonable expectation of privacy. For instance, me personally, I have no problem with companies knowing that I'm a man and that I live in Las Vegas, right?
Okay.
Because there's exactly, what, 1.2 million men who live in Las Vegas. I think that's
okay.
like reasonable privacy.
You think you can
for me.
hide? Okay.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure I can hide amongst 1.2 million,
Okay.
right?
Okay, just ask.
What I do have a problem with is that they know that I'm Dave Hughesby and that I live at this address and that I visit this Starbucks and then I go here and then I like to do this on the weekends, and like knowing all of these other things about me that they then use to get out ahead of me and predict my future behavior so that they can be the store that I drive by next, or that they're the ad that I see on the next web page, and that the message is tailored very specifically to entice me. Like, I don't want them to be out ahead of me in terms of my behavior. So I want the data to be imprecise enough that they can't individually identify me. I'm part of some bigger class. And I think if you just talk to people, next time you have a cocktail party at your house, ask them what they think about what their reasonable expectation of privacy is. And my litmus test is, does my mom feel like her privacy was violated? Because she's not technical. But she does come to me and she goes, how did they know that, I wanted to do this? And I'm just like, because they're not nice people, Mom. And they built a system that's tracking everything you do, and you're typing in all of your information into every form on the web. That's how they know this. And actually, it's not even that. It's like you need to just turn up your privacy settings a little bit. So to get back to health.
Okay. Yeah.
In the LGBTQAI,
Yes.
did I get them all?
Yes.
In that panel,
IA.
Sorry, excuse me. I think was it Amy that was giving the talk? No, it was, I don't remember who it was. I apologize. But they had said to the effect that physicians are reporting transgender as endocrine condition, otherwise
right.
unspecified.
Yeah. Unspecified endocrine disorder.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a perfect practical example of giving imprecise data to protect privacy. Okay? This does not tell anybody that they're a transgender person. This just says that they have an unspecified endocrine
That's right.
condition.
Endocrine disorders are much broader than what sex you are. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think what they've found is that this is a sweet spot of we can report just enough data that the insurance company is happy and will reimburse whatever medications or whatever that are prescribed, but they won't violate the patient's privacy, right?
Okay.
And so what I want to see happen when you apply blockchains
Okay.
to build these systems is that you do what's called hierarchical data, where you have macro data that has less protection around it, all the way down to like the fine-grained stuff where I have total sovereignty over it. So I don't mind that my insurance company knows I'm a guy, and then I like to work out and I like to do these things, but they don't need to know that I broke my distal metatarsal 4 years ago and it still bothers me sometimes. And they don't need to know that, but my podiatrist does, right? My GP would. And so what I would want to do is, if it's really bothering me and I want to go on a hike and I want maybe some treatment for it, I could go to my doctor and I could issue an authorization for them to one-time access that data, or at least the treatment history of that condition that I have, and then go, oh yeah, okay, did that last medication work for you? How did that work? And I'd be like, yeah, it worked great. Okay, here's a prescription, right? And then have them report it to the insurance company as, muscular skeletal issue, right? Like, they don't have to tell them that it's because I had a broken bone in my foot. I'm hoping that's the system we can get to.
No.
Yeah, well, so-
Okay, yeah, maybe I shouldn't talk as a doctor, but here's the problem. as a psychiatrist, I did a lot of that imprecise, I think, what did you call it? Yeah,
Reducing
imprecise.
precision. to
Yeah,
protect
and I
privacy.
might have told you all this before, but, virtually every psychiatric or addictive diagnosis is horrendous. It'll destroy somebody's life. So who wants to do that? And you want to help people. So pretty much everything until we're up against the wall is anxiety disorder not otherwise specified. And that's called downcoding. But the problem, of course, is with the medical records now, if you put down a diagnosis, all of the other supporting data better be there, or else you're a fraud, possibly?
Oh, you're saying you could be
Yeah.
accused of prescribing
like,
medication
yes.
to people who are just addicts and not really.
Something, yeah, exactly. And so we're kind of caught in a trap, and we used to be able to protect people. But this is such an interesting idea about, really, the truth is you might not know this, but also the law changed to where physicians went from, what was it, y'all, about 25,000 codes to 250,000 codes, okay? Let me just ask you this, all you patients out there. Do you think that having more names for what's wrong is going to substantially help your treatment? Well, a lot of them are fragments of diagnoses, and then there's just weird ones like ran into a light post or bitten by a parrot or something,
That was my favorite.
But
I went to my doctor and said, "Can you just put it down as bitten by a parrot, please?"
Yeah, no, and it's created a whole new. Actually, it's a job creator, right? Because who's going to learn all these anyway? But it's mainly driven by the billing and insurance industry, so that they can capture every possible thing about you to bill you. So it's a problem. I mean, anyway, I think this is a great point for. We have 10 minutes of questions for him. Please come and ask him, particularly about health and how this can work or not work for us. But, the idea of imprecise, is immediately appealing to me because I'm in a sensitive specialty.
And there's one other piece of technology we're starting to see now that's privacy enhancing, which is you said you would have to have this extra data, right, to support that kind of a diagnosis. When you start putting data in these structured formats and you're tracking it with a blockchain, you make them things that you can do computations on.
Yeah.
Okay, you make the data computational. And then there's this whole other branch of mathematics called zero knowledge proofs. And it would allow you to cryptographically, to securely prove.
Put the proof there.
Prove that you have the supporting data without disclosing it.
I wonder if they'd buy that.
It is it's a mathematical thing. This is not whether you should trust me or not. Math is math. It does 1 + 1 = 2.
Okay.
These zero knowledge proofs are math formulas, and they're statistical ways of proving something to be true without actually disclosing the pieces. It comes from a long-standing problem of you want to buy my land, I want to know you have the money, and I'm I want to know you have the title. Right, so
Trust,
there is a way to do this mathematically using information theory, game theory. So we can do zero knowledge proofs without disclosing this kind of stuff. So you could eventually protect your privacy of your patients and still protect yourself by doing a zero knowledge proof that you've done due diligence as a physician.
Adrian, you want to start, and then we'll go to you.
Yay, Adrian. This guy grills me all the time, by the way. I like him.
I like you. So you mentioned two things that I think I'd like to dive into a tiny bit deeper. You mentioned the importance of blockchain technology for identity management and for credentialing.
Yes.
And one of the things that sort of drove the huge investment in Bitcoin and the progress that it made as a currency is the fact that it enabled people to interact as individuals across borders and without worrying that they were unbanked. So it became a very popular way of, say, doing remittances from a rich country to a poorer one. Now, in the case of currency transactions, people then had to scramble to put back the know your customer laws, the anti-money laundering laws, the functions of a bank as a trusted institution. And you mentioned the issue about having this consensus, for example, or whatever it is. But now, when we apply this and I completely agree, this blockchain identity and credentialing component to healthcare, to health records, all of a sudden now the principals, Dr. Peel, with her DEA number, no matter whether it's republished or managed by some other intermediary, are now, we're back to the days of paper prescriptions, where there didn't have to be a hospital involved.
Correct. Yeah, this is
And-
reestablishing the original order of medicine.
Okay.
That sounds good.
Yeah, I mean, it's,
given that-
and
Doctor,
it's,
patient?
it's like encrypted email restored the original order of writing letters, and why the Fourth Amendment says persons are papers, right? Like papers.
So there's two questions there. So first of all, do you agree that this is a qualitatively more interesting application of blockchains than just currency transactions?
Absolutely.
Okay. And
Absolutely,
the second
without
thing,
doubt.
which again gets to the Linux Foundation mission, as you described it, is will this introduce a new way of scaling health records, where we're no longer concerned about health information exchanges as institutions, or even hospitals, or the data brokers that we like to talk about at PPR occasionally, that the scaling problems as a foundational technology that, as you mentioned, the last problem that we know of so far in computer science, will this change the scaling rules by taking institutions out of healthcare?
No, but by shifting the power back towards the patient and the principals acting on this, we can use blockchain to enhance the portability and to enhance the cooperation between all the industries. Like right now what you have is siloed data. The hospital has a big pile of data on you. Your insurance company has a big pile of data on you. With blockchains being a ledger that tracks all the access and manipulation of this data, we now have a real reason to say, no, you guys all need to pool the money, or sorry, pool all the, wow, that was a Freudian slip.
Oh, dear.
Pool the money, you mean, I meant the records, pool the records all in.
Yeah, that is what it is. It's very valuable.
And in some way that, like, wasn't the purpose of HIPAA to be portability? Right?
It was the
Health
you're correct.
Health
Portability.
insurance, portability
And Accountability Act. And we
Yeah.
don't have portability or accountability, so this is great.
And honestly, I would hope that in the same vein that the Sovereign Foundation is trying to build a public utility for identity, that I would love to see a health records foundation or a health records nonprofit that says, you know what, we're just going to run a whole bunch of servers and we're going to store all your data encrypted in these things as a nonprofit service. And we'll actually be a principal on the blockchain, and then everybody else will participate, because the health records are not going to be stored in the blockchain. They'll be stored off, and they'll have to be in a database, a traditional database, a traditional data store. But then the access and validation of all that will be recorded in this blockchain that will be a public utility. And I would like to see this
sounds
data.
good.
I would like to see this data just like, you know, through osmotic pressure, get pushed into sort of these nonprofit entities that we as a society can be like, yeah, you know, it's great. I mean, I would love it if when I wanted to go vote, if I could give the polling place a verifiable claim, which is a cryptographic proof, that they then run against a blockchain that the
Las Vegas voter registration.
whatever, yeah, or like, you know, any civil rights organization,
Okay.
and have them go, yep,
He's a person.
he can vote in
this
your jurisdiction.
In this place. Yeah.
And I didn't have to disclose who I was or how old I was or whatever.
Yes.
I gave that
would
the
be ideal
data.
for
Yeah.
voting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Next question.
Great discussion. Thank you to our host and David for flying out from Las Vegas. Dan
Sure.
from the Government Blockchain Association.
Government? Government
Blockchain
is working on
Association.
blockchain. Wow.
We're trying to brief federal, because we're here in DC, but global governmental organizations about these issues. So David, blockchain, we see it as an opportunity.
Yeah.
Fraud is rampant in the $1 trillion level globally in all types of fraud, and certainly the WannaCry virus. I think as a globe, we're craving security without a loss in functionality. So could you put a sharper point on that trade-off? Technology is neutral, we talked earlier.
Yeah, it's just a tool. It can be used for good or for evil.
And then maybe a smart contract and how that can enable some of these higher security with greater functionality.
So let me take what a smart contract is. You guys are going to start hearing this too. So what I was saying earlier is when you start storing data and managing it using a blockchain, managing the access to it in a blockchain, you can make it computational. And a smart contract and a verifiable claim are, all verifiable claims are smart contracts, but not all smart contracts are verifiable claims. And really what it is it's just a piece of software that says to any computer that's participating, it says to that computer, if you go and look at this piece of data and you do a calculation on that data, the answer you get will be this. Okay, and I can claim that I know the answer, and I can say, look, I know this record exists, and that smart contract will say, verify that this record exists, and that record could be my birth certificate, right? So the birth certificate exists. I was born. Okay, so that could be one thing it has to do. Okay, and then the other has to do like extract the date of birth year, right, and subtract it from the current year. Okay, and then store that number. And then if that number is greater than 21, then this entire smart contract comes back as logically true. Okay, I was born in a year that's more than 21 years ago. So the answer to that verifiable claim is true. So it becomes like a logic puzzle that a computer can solve. And we can trust that it's true because the pointers to the data are stored in a blockchain that can't be ever changed. And the data itself has integrity checks that are also stored in the blockchain. And so by looking in the blockchain, you can prove that the document existed, that it hasn't been changed, and therefore the data, and that it exists, and that the data that's on it is valid, and then you can do this automatic calculation to say, yep, he can buy alcohol. And it's all backed on cryptography and math, like numbers so big that you could count all the stars in the universe multiple times, right, and never run out of numbers. So it's really big math, really solid science that allows us to do these operational decisions.
So you think science is going to fly in the current environment?
I mean, I assume that it's...
I'm hopeful, but
I think the
I'm
reason
sure.
we went to science was because the common sense argument
Didn't work.
Doesn't
Didn't
work.
work.
No.
Tom? I'm sorry, this will have to be the last question. He's fabulous, but he's here all day. Okay?
I have to take off in about an hour, but
an hour?
I have a meeting tomorrow morning in San Francisco.
Okay.
So, but I'll be out and
Okay.
about to answer questions.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Since you came at this from a mathematical paradigm at one point,
Yeah.
I want to ask you a question in that perspective. I think blockchain is a good possible next solution around privacy. At what point, though, let's just say I'm Google, and currently at the moment I can do 100 trillion correlation operations a second.
They can already do that, I think.
Though they can. They're over 100 trillion.
Yeah.
They're over 100 trillion. So with that processing capability and that correlation mathematical modeling capability, at what point does having blockchain become irrelevant? Because there'll be enough individual data points out there that I can correlate those and be very specific on who you are, what treatment you've had, where you're going, what your mental health is going to look like for the next 50 years in a mathematical probability modeling perspective.
Yeah.
Is there some point in time that you see that making this other conversation irrelevant?
No, I think this modifies that conversation. So in the world, we don't have any real privacy. In fact, I think I just read a couple weeks ago that some AI was able to diagnose cancer like 6 months before the doctors could.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how good correlation's getting.
Yeah.
But I think, I'm not a politician.
Well, let me
I'm
ask it
not.
another way. Can we use that modeling? So Joe Kanatachi, who's the head of the United Nations
He's the
Privacy and Security,
First special rapporteur for the right to
Rapporteur.
privacy.
his concept is a sphere of privacy.
Uh-huh.
So in other words, there needs to be a capability where that sphere of privacy is defined so that correlation of data then cannot pass through that membrane,
Yeah.
the sphere of privacy. That's a total different conversation than what we've been having here.
No, it's exactly what I was talking about earlier. So I think that model's wrong. I'm just going to say it right out. Because it's based on the assumption that you can have total privacy or not total privacy. and
No,
that
it's
that
based upon you can define privacy and then have rules as to who can access it.
Okay, so maybe that's in line with what I was saying. So,
think it is.
so
That's
the
what
stuff
I'm
that's inside the sphere would be the extremely precise data that I would have sovereignty over. But the stuff that's outside that sphere is sort of the more broad stuff, like I'm a guy who lives in Las Vegas. That's not really secret. In fact, there's a million ways to determine that.
Yeah.
And just by me going to the store, you would know. So, or me hitting a web page where my IP address was revealed. I like that model, and I think that's only possible with blockchain, honestly.
Okay, that's a
Thank
good
you.
answer.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. I hope you all learned something about blockchain, at least a little, and
Oh, yeah, we were up to
we really appreciate you coming here and talking.
Anytime.
Thank you. All right. So we are about to have two panels, and the one that's in this room is going to be on state health databases, the re-identification of patient records, and the expansion of the data map. So, Jisoo, I hope you'll come up and with the students. And in room 200, we're going to have Ifeoma Junwa and her panel on wellness, workplace wellness, and genetic testing, employee genetic testing. Should employers and insurers have access to genetic tests? These are tough choices, but whichever one you pick, you can see the other one later. So, stay or go. Time for the next session. Thank you.
I'm going to step out right here, so if you have more questions, I'll be right
Thank you, David. Would you all mind going outside, David? You're fabulous. But we have this amazing panel coming up right now. The leader of this panel is going to be Jisoo Yu, and she is a research assistant at Harvard with Professor LaTanya Sweeney's Data Privacy Lab, and we are so honored to have her here. She is going to begin to, as you know, every year LaTanya comes herself, and she'll be here tomorrow. But this is part of her team, and by extension, to help expand the data map. And I think everybody already knows we don't have a data map, and the need to build one out is critical. And so let's please welcome Jisoo Yu, and she will introduce the wonderful panelists who also contributed to the data map. And so thank you.
Yeah, hi everyone. Like Deb said, my name is Jisoo. These are my students. I teach with LaTanya Sweeney at Harvard. Two different courses. So two of the students are from a freshman seminar called Technology Science to Save the World. And one of the students was in a government class, and the name of the class was The Politics of Personal Data. So as you can see, they are both coming from a different perspective on how they look at patient records, right? One from a government lens and another one from a technology lens. But we still had them both work on re-identification cases because it's exciting, it's different, and it shows them a lot of the real world impact of looking at databases that are widely shared and widely distributed. So they are going to come up and talk about the methodology that we used for these re-identifications a little bit after, and they'll introduce themselves as well. And I am going to just talk to you very broadly about why we're doing this, what's the point, right? It's just LaTanya and her team. It's a niche group. Who's going to be affected, right? Who's going to actually look at these very, very fine-grained data line entries that some random electronic medical health record inputted and distributed out, right? So really quickly, let me tell you a story. It's a true story, but I'm going to use an alias because as we're trying to protect patients from their information being distributed everywhere. But Steve Hannigan, he was in a car crash, and his condition, his diagnoses, formal and very accurate medical information was inputted into an electronic medical record. Now, he expects that his information will go to his doctor, that it will go to his hospital. It will also go to his insurance claims, etc. But he does not expect that his data will go to everybody else, including sometimes your employer, your life insurance company. And he does not expect that his information will go from him to the hospital to becoming discharge data, de-identified, of course, but that people will purchase this data. And these people include large insurance companies. Now, these are the flows of information that are covered by HIPAA, the ones that are in straight lines. But of course, HIPAA being the Health Information Portability and Accountability Act. And that means that, these are covered entities, and the United States has said that HIPAA governs the privacy of personal health information in this sense. It dictates who can get this information, but HIPAA covers less than half of this data sharing that we're looking at. And this information was revealed to us through data breaches that we went through. And this is the very essence of the data map. But what we're looking at now is, okay, so what about these discharge data? Right? So we look very specifically at the discharge data, and what we get, if my pointer will go, is some of the statutes, right? So this is an example of Vermont's statute of the mandate to share discharge data. So Steve is in this data. He doesn't know it. He might know that something about him is floating around in the air, right? But states are really, how shall I say, concerned and want to really favorably release this data so that research, innovation, and possibly good healthcare reform will come out of the data analysis, right? And what happens is that Vermont has been sharing this data since the 1980s, right? And this is just an example. There are 33 other states that share and sell information as hospital discharge data. But let's look at the very specifics of Vermont. There is case-specific diagnostic data, sociodemographic data, the medical reason for admission, treatment and services, duration and status of the patient, stay, not in years, but in specific days, and information about services, right? And this all has to do with specific diagnostic codes. So then, what is the nature of this? We have age groups, we have zip code, we have the gender, hospital service area, and different. Oh, okay. Sorry, I'll stay on the mic. Different information about the discharge of that particular patient. Now, seems my slides are out of order. Now, these are the people who are going to be able to purchase the data. The states also share who are the major people who purchase this. And we've compiled a list of some of the major purchases of different states. Now, I'm wondering, what are they doing with this de-identified data, right? They're healthcare companies, it makes sense, they run data analytics. But another thing that happens is that it's not very clear who is participating in these data sharing agreements and who is standing to benefit from these agreements and who is standing to be harmed from these agreements. So there's another story that I want to share with you of a woman whose alias is Amy Sanders. Now, Amy, she is from out of state. She also went to Vermont and she got in a car accident. She was one of the only few pedestrians who was hit by another car in this entire database. We were able to find her, and my students will go over the methodology, but we were able to find her and we were able to see that not only was she in a car accident, but she also had several different drug overdose instances, that she had cocaine dependencies, that she had different psychological issues. And this is the specificity of the data. I don't know if a lot of you are familiar with ICD-9 codes, but they're very specific. So we also understand that there are marital problems that are reported in discharge data, and all of this information is divulged to us by re-identification processes. Of course, we wouldn't know this data if hospital discharge data didn't include all these previous diagnoses, right? So we don't just learn about the specific instance that a person went into the hospital for. We learn about their entire health history that is more or less very, very private information. There's also a story that I want to share with you of a college student who was in an accident as well. And she was also a pedestrian and she was hit by a car. And she had a broken leg, and as the ICD-9 code suggests, she's the pedestrian in the motor vehicle accident. We also learned that she has anxiety, she has depression. Now, she's a college student, and this information is not something you want around when you're a newly minted undergrad, right? So these are real people with real consequences for what if their information does get out, this aggregated information. Now, HIPAA provides very limited protection for them. And even though HIPAA provides limited information and we can, trash talk on how bad HIPAA is or how, maybe we still believe that it is a good enough measure for protecting patients, HIPAA standards are not used when state health databases are shared or disclosed, sadly. As I mentioned before, 33 states sell or share personal health data, but only 3 use HIPAA standards. And when we did a survey of what types of fields were disclosed, we were able to see, the level of HIPAA compliance. It's very strict when it comes to demographic fields. And this might come from a belief that, if we suppress all the demographics, no one will be able to find them, right? If we use k-anonymity to generalize, the 5 patients that have very unique records in our database, we won't be able to find them because demographics are all that matter. But that's not true, as we will show. And we also have this belief that, we can let admission and discharge fields be as specific as ICD-9 codes because no one will use them to find anybody in the database, right? Because we don't think that those fields can be used to find people in this data. Now, in the winter of 2015, Professor LaTanya Sweeney did a re-identification of Washington State's healthcare database. And what she found was that 43% of news stories that she went through, these news stories reveal information about local car crashes, local accidents, etc. She was able to find 43% of those news stories corresponded uniquely to people in the Washington State database. And this is the method that she used, basically taking the public records, which is like, there's information online about your zip code and address. And then she was able to match it with your age, residence, and name that appeared in news stories. And the news stories would then reveal more information about this particular person, such as their gender, hospital that they were admitted to, and admission month. Now you take that aggregated data set that we just constructed, and then you use it to find the people in the hospital data. We're gonna use a similar methodology when my students talk about specifics of Maine and Vermont. We didn't use public records in Maine and Vermont, and we still were able to find them. In any case, news stories have information that others know, right? But in this way, we're able to tie it to a very official health record. Now, we had really good response in Washington. After we published, or after LaTanya published, there were 2 states that responded very favorably, and they changed the way that they released the information. So, we have those check marks, and we're like, yes, we're making change. And the point of these re-identifications is not to say, okay, here's pointing a finger, shame on you, because we were able to find them. But it's more about, we're exposing just the existence of a vulnerability in hopes that improved methods will arise out of this, right? And we're not here to say, oh, you should have this particular method or this method. It's more about, here is the existence of a vulnerability. And now we're going to go into the specifics of how we went through this data. And they are Harvard students. They're fantastic, accomplished people. And it's really great to have had the privilege to work with them and also to get them interested in a particular field of understanding patients and their privacy, as well as how they're interacting with government systems. And they individually also have some interest in medicine. Alexandra, who is going to talk about Vermont, is a government major, and she is also a pre-med. So, she has a lot at stake in terms of understanding what is important when she interacts with her patients. And then our 2 freshmen are thinking of, Basina is thinking of concentrating in history of science with a minor in computer science. So we have people who are computer people thinking about the ethics and the privacy aspect, which is exciting, right? This is the progeny of this community. And then Harshita is also thinking computer science, I think, but she has a lot of talent. So she's like also thinking, what were you thinking?
Social studies or computer science, yeah.
Yeah, social studies as well. So we have people who are very interdisciplinary minded, and they understand that this takes a component of technology and also takes a component of what is already existing and how technology is influencing the ways that we look at electronic health systems and data sharing paradigms. So with that, Ali, do you want to come up?
Hi, so as Jisoo mentioned, I'm Ali Thaler, and I'm going to talk about the methods and results that we obtained from Vermont. So here is just a few screenshots of the data that we found on Vermont's website called healthvermont.gov. As you can see, there are many, many data fields, and we extracted data that matched 8 of these, but this is to show that there's a huge wealth that's being recorded that we didn't even need to use in order to match various patients. So how did we go about this in Vermont? We first obtained articles using LexisNexis, primarily from the Keene Sentinel from New Hampshire, but with Vermont references, and the Brattleboro Reformer. And both of these newspapers included people that went to hospitals located in Vermont. So in order to find articles that would be relevant to our study, we used different keywords like hospitalized, transported, injured, hospital, and medical, and obtained the 8 data fields that you can see to the right. And by using these data fields, we were able to extract information that would be able to connect us with the patient record. Next, so out of the 69 total articles after our search, 14 of those articles mentioned patients that went to Vermont hospitals. Some of those patients that were involved in accidents went to a hospital on the border in New Hampshire, but that wasn't relevant to our data set, so we ignored those. That's where the others besides those 14 articles went. And out of the articles, we extracted different parts that would be necessary for cross-referencing. Those included the hospital code, for instance, Brattleboro Memorial Hospital, the sex of the patient, age, zip code, and date admitted, and then those translated into codes. This next slide shows exactly how that information was pulled out of the article. So as you can see in red, the Brattleboro Memorial Hospital is coded as 15 in the data set, and continuing on, the age is also coded. The age has a range, but it's still specific enough to be easily used in identifying patients. Again, same thing with the zip code. It's also in a range, but that didn't stop us from re-identifying either. The sex, 1 for male, 2 for female, and as you can see, the newspaper article describes facial injuries, and we found in the unique match that is shown to the right, the closed fracture of orbital floor is exactly describing the facial injuries. Just to further confirm, the E code, which is also an ICD-9 code, also matches the other motor vehicle traffic incident involving a collision. Again, corroborates that this is indeed a match. So initially we filtered using Excel just as our preliminary result, or to get preliminary results. After using the fields that I mentioned previously, we distinguished between similar matches with the diagnosis and emergency codes. And then we saw that not only could we re-identify, but we could also include additional diagnoses that were often unrelated. So it goes beyond a simple match. We could find more, as Jisoo mentioned a little bit. But anyway, so our initial preliminary result was 42.9% of the newspaper articles could be successfully matched to patient records. And this is using only Excel. So with that, we decided to expand, and now we included 201 articles. They were again categorized, and this time we automated it using Python so that we could cover more ground quickly. So the first one, this is also an alias, John Richards, and this slide is, I guess, most startling to me. The man from the article on the left side of the screen, you can see what we learned from the article is that he's 49 years old, a resident of Lebanon, New Hampshire, was taken to a Vermont hospital, however, so he's out of state. He was involved in a motor vehicle accident on a highway and sustained facial injuries. That's all we know about John Richards. After we cross-referenced and re-identified him successfully, now we know that not only did he sustain facial injuries, but he is a diabetic, he's morbidly obese, and he has hyperlipidemia, which is a disease with an abnormally high concentration of fat in his blood. So that shows beyond simply matching him to a record that he has very serious pre-existing conditions that could be used to discriminate against him, and you would never know any of this information about John Richards had he not had the misfortune of being in a motor vehicle accident. So that, to me, is the most astounding part of the re-identification. Overall, just to give you a quantitative summary, we had 270 articles returned in our LexisNexis search. 46 describe patients taken to Vermont hospitals. 32 returned results in the cross-reference process, which means that they included all of the fields that we needed. 12 out of those 32 could be matched to one unique name, 30%, and 19 were successfully matched with a bin sizer 1 or 2. So that was a very large percentage of matching. So just where has this gone since the 2011 data that we have used in this project? The ICD-9 codes are now updated to be ICD-10 codes, and those include, for example, this is one of the additions, a large degree of specificity in unemployment status, including change of job, or these are listed as diagnoses that you would find even if you got in a car accident. Change of job is a diagnosis, threat of job loss, stressful work schedule, discourse with boss and workmates, uncongenial work environment, other physical and mental strains relating to work, and sexual harassment on the job. So those are unemployment status diagnoses that really are completely unrelated to if you broke your arm in a car accident. All of a sudden, just because you happen to get in a car accident, maybe on a rainy day or something, all of a sudden now the public can know that you have an uncongenial work environment or are being threatened with job loss. So maybe were you distracted when you were driving your car? I don't know. There's lots of room for speculation. So that's just one example of how specific these codes are getting and the definite vulnerability in the way that data is publicly available.
Ali, really quickly, can you talk about what a bin size is?
Oh,
So
yeah.
you talked about 1 or 2 bin
Yeah.
sizes. If you want to just explain that a little
Yeah.
bit.
So the bin size means that when they were cross-referenced, if we weren't sure if there were 1 or 2 matches, so all of the fields matched and we got 2 returns on that, then we would say, okay, well, it's a match to 1 or 2. So it wasn't a unique match, but it was still between 1 or 2, if that clears that up.
Hi, I'm Basina Ganther. I'm a student at Harvard.
My name's Harshita Gupta, and I'm also a student at Harvard. Cool. So we're going to talk about the data that we re-identified for Maine. Yes, we had Maine inpatient records from 2010, which list admits to the hospital with all of the information that Ali described previously. We'll show you the database details, specifics in a bit.
So we use Nexus. We use LexisNexis, the database, to search through newspaper articles, and we found that most of our articles came from Portland Press Herald, Bangor Daily News, and Portsmouth Herald. We found 270 unique articles that involved patients being sent to a hospital in Maine.
You can see what the inpatient record for Maine looks like in these fields. Just to point some of them out, you have race and ethnicity, you have the typical demographic codes, but you also have things like the revenue codes, which list specifically what the insurance was charged for. You have up to 10 diagnoses, and these include pre-existing diagnoses, which are entered in for all patients irrespective of what they come in for. You see a bunch of this information that once we just match on simple fields, like we'll show you, we matched for patient sex and a bunch of demographic information, but we were able to find all of this rest out. Maine is not HIPAA compliant, unlike Vermont, so the data has very specific information on the geographic area. There's geocode is one of the fields listed in the inpatient records, and that lists a very specific town and area. It's very easy to find the key and legend for what geocode corresponds to what area, and these are publicly available. So this is kind of the data that we were working with and matching to the newspaper articles.
So here's just another example of collecting data from an article. So this is an article we found about a man whose car collided with a moose, and they were sent to the hospital. And so you can just see we basically just pull out basic information from the article and match it to the different data fields that we were going to search for. So once we found the different data fields, we then basically converted it into inpatient data. So if you see the data publication, the article was published in September 2010. So that matches to Q3. So all of the inpatient data, the year, because it's not HIPAA compliant, it's based off of the quarter for the year. So Q1, 2, 3, or 4, based off of the time it is in the year, patient's age, patient sex, the geocode, which was actually one of the most important parts of it, was being able to find the geocode, because some of these people came from really small towns where there weren't that many, like it wasn't that hard to pinpoint it because the town was so small and there weren't so many people living in each town. And then hospital codes, so where they were sent to hospitals, especially for smaller hospitals. Oh, okay. Oh, so the inpatient data, it's free and available online. So we found it for,
So this is from 2010, so it is no longer available. And Maine has updated the level of application and how they release the data. So for Maine now, you have to, have a data use agreement, et cetera. It's 2017 now, but this is 2010 data, but the fields are still very similar.
For Vermont data, it's readily available to download online. The 2011 data all through 2016, I believe, is accessible on healthvermont.gov. Anyone open to the public can download the data set.
The question was, is there a Maine statute that required the disclosure of the geocode in 2010? Required the disclosure?
We don't know the specifics of whether the geocode was required to be disclosed. We just...
Oh, no.
Well, the way that we talk about HIPAA compliance is when you are sharing data and you de-identify the data according to Safe Harbor Agreement, you should take out anything that's smaller than a zip code, depending on the population density of that geographic area. But what happens with Maine is that it's smaller than a zip code. So that's why we say it's not HIPAA compliant. I wouldn't be able to tell you that. Oh, the question was whether there was a Maine statute that required the hospitals to release the geocode in addition inside the database, or whether the Maine hospitals themselves decided this. We wouldn't be able to tell you. We're not lawyers, so we didn't look at, the hospitals didn't want to release it, but they were mandated to, right? We just know what we have, and we say, okay, this is what we have, then this is what we work with, right?
Okay.
So the data that we have here is what we use to run through our Python program and find matches. And then once we had matches, like Ali said, 2 or 3 matches might come up for a single newspaper article. And then we use the ICD-9 codes, which list specific diagnoses to figure out what is an exact match. So if the newspaper article described a head injury, we would look at the 3 matches that came up for the given demographic information, and then use the diagnosis as a confirmation for which match is the one that lines up with the newspaper article. This is kind of different than Ali's approach because we just use demographic information. We aren't matching to begin with on diagnoses. It kind of shows what the non-HIPAA compliance does for us, the fact that Maine's demographic information in the inpatient data is pretty specific and allows us to, in a lot of cases, led to a unique match almost immediately, and then we were able to find diagnoses from it. So
So in this example of David Jameson, we were able to find that they were patient ID 954. These are not the actual numbers, like accurate numbers. And through that, once you find the patient ID, you're then able to find other records for this person that were not going to be that would not have been available had they not had the newspaper article written about them. So we were able to find that David Jameson had depression, PTSD symptoms, and burn tissue, all just from the newspaper article, which, of course, these symptoms have nothing to do with the car crash that David Jameson was in. So.
yeah, this is just a comparison of what came from the article and what came from the data after we re-identified it. This is another example of a Jane Doe alias, of course, and this stood out because she was mauled and dragged by a bulldog, and there was a lot of press coverage on this. There was a lot of community organizing around supporting her. She had pretty serious head and arm injuries. So a lot of media coverage, and because it's such a unique injury and it's a dog bite, the ICD-9 code was very straightforward. There's a code for a dog bite. We have it listed up there. There was a single match, and we were able to find pre-existing conditions of tobacco use disorder, asthma, meningitis, and a lot of press coverage around this, so it's one of the most easily identifiable records in the database and tells us a lot about the patient. And here you see, this is all of the information we were able to find about this patient. This is the entire inpatient record with some of the codes swapped out for their word descriptions, but you can see all of the insurance charges are here. You can see pre-existing diagnoses, and the dog bite one shows up here, and then the wound to the elbow, tobacco use disorder, asthma, etc. And yes, you can see the hospital code. So this is part of what we used for the original match, hospital service area of the patient, and then the geo code as well, which matched the area listed in the article.
So so here the final results are: we found about 1,112 articles were returned from the LexisNexis database, and of those we were able to find 270 unique articles about patients taken to Maine hospitals. When we went through and used Python to match it to inpatient data, we found 132 that had matches, and of those 132, 53 of them could be matched to a specific name. So that's about 40%, which is quite a lot.
And just for clarification purposes, we didn't look for articles that gave us all of the fields we needed. We took the ones it was able to give us, and then we matched based on those. So not all of the 8 fields were necessarily met, but we were still able to find matches with, like, say, 5 of those 8 met. So, yep, this is just a summary of our work, and we will turn it back over to Jisoo to wrap up.
So thank you guys for discussing some of the specifics. As you can tell, like this was a work that was done in a class, but it really means something when you take sometimes disillusioned students who are like, oh, this is all theoretical government work, or this is all, mathematics that I'm never going to use. And they actually apply their skills into a real world issue, and the light kind of like shines in their eyes because they understand, right? This is something that could impact me if I have different information in hospital data set. And we didn't even think about, the crossover between these two states, right? If I'm able to find somebody in one state database and then I can find them in another one, because like Ali talked about, a lot of the people who are going to Vermont hospitals, we could also find them in New Hampshire hospitals because they share such a large border. So there's a lot of ways that people can kind of disentangle a lot of the details. And we didn't even begin to cover all the different examples that we saw, not only with marital condition and mental health problems, we also saw birth data, right? There were defects. There was information about any complications during the pregnancy. So I don't know about you, and I don't think this is speculation, because I have heard of many stories in this auditorium about people being blamed by their employers or being single-handedly pointed out because their children have birth issues or they had a complicated pregnancy, right? So there are ways that, you know, if I was an employer, I don't know if this happens, but I know of very specific incidences where employers will be able to find out who had raised the rates for everybody else in a small company. So there are very financial, emotional, and a lot of consequences that can arise if these methods are used not in order to make, you know, healthcare available for more people or for health outcomes to improve. Now, the next step is to expand this study to other states. And our goal is not to say, okay, stop sharing this hospital discharge data. And our goal is not to say everyone should be HIPAA compliant, because, you know, HIPAA has its own issues. But we're here to say, okay, we need to examine what are the better ways that we can start sharing this data so that there's a lot more utility and a lot of more preservation of privacy, right? So we have 29 states to go out of the 33, and we're hoping that we'll get favorable responses to understand that there are some real-world vulnerabilities here. Like I said, we're not asking specifics, right? Because we know that HIPAA, it's not enough. And in our upcoming publication with me and Professor LaTanya Sweeney, we're looking at data about specific individuals that has been redacted beyond HIPAA. We're talking about dates being reported as decade groups. We're talking about suppression of different fields, and we still have 20% re-identification rates. So again, the answer is not more suppression or more generalizability or more sophisticated statistic methods. It's about considering what is out there and what vulnerabilities will exist through experiments like these. So thank you all so much for listening. And I think we have time for a few questions. I'm not sure how long, but. Okay, great.
Okay, I just have one question. You mentioned that you're going to be doing studies at some of the other states. You already have results from 4 states. Why can't you just go to those other states and say, hey, these are the results of the studies we have done, so therefore you might want to look into your practices?
I wish, right? But what ends up happening is what we saw with Washington. So, brand name Professor LaTanya Sweeney pushes out this publication and says, there is a problem that you might want to look into, right? And even then, people say, oh, no, we aggregated our zip codes in this way, and we changed the demographics in this way, or we changed the way that we report. Now we have data use agreements. Now we have, very specific requirements about who can get it. So they have these ways of saying we're not part of Washington. Our data is not the same as Maine. We're not a small town state like Vermont. So that doesn't apply to us. And you can see there's a lot of incentive to not want to change a lot of the things because either you don't perceive it as a threat, or maybe there are other ways that you think fixing the problem will work. So I can't speak to why they haven't changed it. I can just say that they haven't changed it.
Was this study presented to an institutional review board, and if so, how did the board respond? Was this study or series of studies presented to an institutional review board? And how did the board respond if it was?
Right, so the question is about whether this study was submitted to an IRB review board. And the answer is Maine and Vermont studies that we presented to you, they are under review. They are under review under a journal, but it's not specifically submitted to IRBs. So yeah, we're not specifically submitting it to Harvard's IRB. We're just submitting it to a publication.
When health information exchanges began, I had very big concerns about just exactly what's happening. And it's even worse because if any of you have read Adam Tanner's book, big businesses will be taking this information and building even bigger databases about all our health information that they have and can't sell. Adam did not mention, he didn't find any examples of where it's being sold, but I have an example of where it's being sold. So I have been against it from the beginning, and I've always thought health information exchanges, if put up by states, should be like telephone books. If you want your name in the telephone book, it can be in the telephone book. Then where you've received care so that your data can then be requested from that doctor or that hospital or whatever, it can be delivered if you've asked for it. But otherwise, I don't think any of these places, including the federal government, which is doing it, should be collecting these kind of databases in the first place. It's a huge privacy violation. And they keep saying they're going to have great conclusions about it. It's going to make our health better. So it's a greater good. But frankly, you know, from time immemorial, you're supposed to be able to go see your doctor and have that information kept quiet. And the government is actually promoting and making this worse. Thank you.
So I actually just looked it up. The Maine statute does require the disclosure of those geocodes. So might one possible solution to this be, and let me back up, the HIPAA privacy rule is obviously a federal floor of health information confidentiality.
Get closer to the microphone, please.
All right. So I'll just shorten my question. My question is, if state law requires a covered entity to do something, that is allowed under the HIPAA privacy rule at 164.512A. So might one solution, if you're having disclosure of identifiers that can allow the re-identification of the patients, to go to your state legislature and say, you may not have known this, but by requiring the disclosure of this patient data, it allows re-identification. So what we need to do is shrink or curtail or kind of shrunk down the state law, because once something is no longer allowed by state law, then it becomes now again prohibited under HIPAA at 164.512A.
I'm not sure what the question was. Oh, yeah. Okay. So I don't think I caught the specific number of legislation that you're talking about, but basically you're saying that if patients rally and talk to their legislature about these geocodes being the most identifying factor, then maybe we can kind of overrule the disclosure of the geocode specifically? Is that what you're saying?
So there's an exception in HIPAA that basically says if some other law requires a disclosure by a hospital, say, to, say, a state public entity, that the hospital can do it and it's not a violation of HIPAA, which is why I asked about why are you saying this is not HIPAA compliant. And I looked it up, and Maine actually has a regulatory provision, which would be another provision of law allowing the disclosure, not allowing, requiring the disclosure of all these identifiers, including the geocodes. So my thought is maybe one thing that we can do is go to Maine and Vermont, if this is the goal you want to achieve, and it might not be, and have them shrink down the number of identifiers they are requiring to be disclosed, right? Because under HIPAA, this is all allowed under 164.512A now. Right, to say it's not HIPAA compliant, that's not actually accurate. What we need to do is fix the state law that you normatively or substantively disagree with. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Right. So yes, the geocodes were important, but it wasn't just the geocode, right? So there were all these other demographic factors. And so we're not here to say, okay, this specific field needs to be suppressed or anything like that, because we have no evidence that that will be the most efficient method. So yeah, like I said, we're just here to say that this is one way the problem exists. There may be plenty of other ways to do re-identifications that we haven't explored, because as you saw, there are so many fields. That might be up to somebody else if they want to do that. But yeah, we're just here to say, okay, here's one way that it was there.
No, I think this is fantastic work, and all I'm trying to say is that I think the states don't realize that with their mandatory disclosure laws, they are opening this up under HIPAA and allowing the amazing work that you are doing. Like, I'm laughing because I'm from the border of Vermont, New Hampshire, so when you say, oh, the hospital on the border of Vermont, New Hampshire, you're talking about Dartmouth, Hitchcock.
Yeah.
And then all my relatives have gotten into motorcycle accidents, so I actually thought that was my cousin up there. I mean, this is amazing work, but at the end of the day, legally, it's Maine and Vermont's fault if we want to blame someone. So the question is whether we need to fix that or not.
Thank you.
Hi. So, first off, it's absolutely amazing work you're doing, and thank you for doing it. It really drives home an important point. In reaction to, I guess it was a couple of questions ago, have you brought this up with, you showed a lot of stuff in the 4 states, have you brought it up with the other states? Have you thought about any approaches to sort of crowdsourcing or distributing what you're doing, where you can get people, get some volunteers in some other states who are animated and moved by what you're doing, to try to do a little bit of work in their state to show one re-identification that shouldn't be able to happen, or push back against the arguments the states are making back to you when they say, oh, we're not like Vermont, we're not like this state, we're not like that state, here's why we're different. If you can get some volunteers in other states to help you, I think you could show them. I don't know if you thought about that. Or is it possible? I should ask as a question.
Yeah, so we are not like one of those nonprofit organizations that has like that crowdsourcing power. Okay. We are just very humble research assistants and students. Okay. So yeah, we try to tackle one thing at a time. Okay. But I mean, I think somebody else could do it. As you can tell, our methods are not complicated. But yeah, we're not advocating for anything. I don't think we have enough knowledge, as she demonstrated, about the laws and specifics about how this could play out. We just are here to do a good job on the work that we are able to do.
You're doing an amazing job. I think everyone in this room agrees.
Thank you.
Hello, Jisoo.
Hi.
Thanks to you and your team. And in summary, I just want to kind of state the obvious, make sure I get the message right. And that is, you're taking health information that's anonymized basically from the public domain, or at least it's easily accessible through relatively informal methods to collect it. You're then taking public information in the form of newspapers, articles, and just correlating those two together to reveal that anonymized data can in fact be de-anonymized and reveal big vulnerabilities about human beings and the potential impact to their lives. And you've done that at a scale of a few hundred. Is that a fair assessment of the work? So the obvious question on a conference that includes the ethics of using machine learning, I always think of how do you scale things out, and you start to ask yourself, well, could we use public records like property records? Could we use social media records? Could we use just your Facebook profile? Could you use a whole series of public information, use machine learning to then correlate that against the public medical records that are anonymous and really scale this out to reveal, a much grander vulnerability than just say 40% of 200 records? And you have a suspicious look on your face. I'm going to give that back to you.
Thank you. So you're asking, if I got it right, whether machine learning could be used to scale this up. So our version of scaling up was going from just visually inspecting these records and these newspaper articles and using then a Python program that was maybe a few lines long. I think you and I and most people here know that the answer is yes. There's a lot of room for algorithms to take what we've done and take it up to scale. But this is what we've been able to do. So if you can imagine somebody who has a lot more resources, maybe, it is possible. I don't think I can say what the identification re-ID rates would be for that. Yeah, I just know that what we found was 40%. So you're saying that if you had, relatively well understood technology, you would be able to, machine learning, you would be able to rev up everything that we've done. I have no doubt in your abilities to do that. But as I said, I don't think I can predict that number for you. I can't predict, given X amount of resources and this amount of expertise, you're going to be able to get this much more. Yeah, this is just.
My motivation would be to be able to demonstrate, to extend your work, to have it be more impactful, to make greater change, because it'd be revealing a far greater problem than just a couple of hundred records, right? And it would be, if you did this at some scale, and obviously you would want to keep your results anonymous, but you could statistically share it. It could have a really big impact. Far greater than just a couple. That was my only tip.
Thank you.
Okay.
Aren't they fabulous? Aren't they wonderful? And yes, Kurt, if you know anyone that has some of those resources, I know the Data Privacy Lab would be glad to do that. We'd love to. That's been a major problem. Where's the resources to scale this up? But I think this was such a terrific panel because we've got young, brilliant people beginning to work on this issue and seeing how important it is. And it's I don't know if it's a coincidence that you're all women, but it's a lovely coincidence. So thank you so much. And they're going to be around tonight too at the gala. So hopefully everyone can talk with them. And anyway, thank you. Thank you again. We got into the break a little bit. Sorry, but you have a few minutes break. We'll pick up back here at. Let's give you 10 minutes if you need it. 10 minutes. Panel, which has to do with health information exchange, and there is health information exchange in some places, and then there's places where it's not so much. So. Tom Welch is going to be the moderator, and we have our panel of experts that he will introduce. So thank you, Tom.
Thank you. Good afternoon. What a juxtaposition with the last panel of beautiful, smart women. We've got the old, crusty guys here, but I guess you can call that diversity. This name of this panel is Patients' Use of Health Information Exchanges. Do they care? Can they get personal health data? How do they use it? My name is Tom Welch. I'm an attorney. I was a programmer before I became an attorney. I worked for 20 years in the US and Europe, including France and Germany. I then became associate director and senior international policy analyst at HHS US FDA in their Office of International Programs. And I've kept up with some data developments. Some of this is way over my head. With us today are Randy Farmer, Chief Operating Officer of the Delaware Health Information Network, Adrian Gropper, Chief Technology Officer, Patient Privacy Rights, John Mandel, Health IT Ecosystem Lead, Verily, Google Health Services, and Glenn Tucker, Chief Medical Information Officer and Chief of Internal Medicine, Sturdy Memorial Hospital, and Chairman, Massachusetts Medical Society's Committee on IT. So we're going to take the patient's perspective here on this panel. And in order to prepare for this, I looked at a couple of recent surveys of patients and what they thought about their data. According to 2 recent surveys, patients are increasingly frustrated with their healthcare experience. The 2016 Connected Care SureScripts survey found that patients are particularly dissatisfied with the lack of central location for their health records, as well as the difficulty in accessing and sharing those records. According to another national survey, which included 12,000 adults, 57% of consumers with contract experience with hospitals, physicians, or ancillary providers report being skeptical of the overall benefits of health information technologies, such as patient portals, mobile apps, and electronic health records, mainly because of recently reported data hacking and a perceived lack of privacy protection by providers. The unwillingness of patients to comprehensively divulge all their medical information rose to 87% in the last quarter of 2016. As Deborah mentioned, lack of disclosure to physicians is a serious problem. We are lucky to have 4 leading experts here, and I'm going to allow Randy to introduce himself and begin. Thank you.
You know, I like the introduction of being a leading expert over old and crusty. I'll take that any day of the week. So thank you, Tom. And thank you, Deb, for again hosting and putting together this austere group on such an important topic. So we're going to go through the slides pretty quickly. I understand I'm the only guy in the panel that brought slides. There's always one jerk in a group that has to have slides, and unfortunately I'm that guy today. But I thought that this might help complement some of the complexities around the topic, and hopefully you find it helpful. So Delaware launched the first statewide health information exchange as a public endeavor, and we currently stand as a nonprofit state-related organization. We're not a state agency. We're kind of a hybrid organization. We don't get any state funding. I'm not a state employee. I don't get state benefits. But we operate like a business where the board of directors is appointed by the governor. We have sovereign immunity like a state agency, and our attorneys come out of the state attorney general's office. So we have some benefits of being state-related, but we also have the independence and the agility to operate as a nonprofit business, which helps us leverage, I guess, maybe some of the best benefits of both of those worlds. Every year we deliver around 14 million results from our participating hospitals, labs, radiology firms, and we do so to over 800, about 500 or so practices and about 11,000 physicians and their staff. We provide on-demand access to the records for those patients that have consented to be involved or have not opted out. And we also provide other services such as event notification that helps with transitions of care. So if a patient is seen at an area hospital and they're on a patient panel, let's say of a primary care provider or let's say an oncologist that wants to track that the clinical aspects of that patient, they will get an alert if they're subscribing to our event notification system. We provide a clinical gateway, which can provide things like discharge summaries to a doctor who has a panel of patients that wants to receive such information. They get that on demand, again, to facilitate transitions to care. We also have a medication history tool, as well as analytic services. So you see, we're a pretty robust organization in terms of the nature of the penetration of the healthcare ecosystem, not just in our state, but also within our region. We have connections with Maryland's HIE, CRISP. We are building a connection with the South Jersey HIE, NJ Shine, and as well as doing so with the Southeast Pennsylvania HSX organization, where we'll have 5 hospitals from the Southeast Pennsylvania area participating. So pretty robust footprint, and it allows us to facilitate better transitions of care, better care outcomes, and reduction of cost. This slide gives you an idea of some of the impact in terms of what we've been able to quantify in terms of the benefit that our HIE provides to the healthcare ecosystem. Over $7 million in annual results delivery savings because of the nature of our network, allowing large healthcare systems to decommission expensive integrations and not have to build integrations to independent organizations. One of the points of pride, and it's not on this slide, but Delaware has a very high percentage of independent practices, those practices not affiliated with a hospital. So if a physician practice is adverse or wishing to be independent of a large hospital healthcare system, they have that choice. And about 75% of our ambulatory practices in the state are independent of a large healthcare system. And we help enable that choice among physicians to remain independent. One of our ACOs noticed after they employed the event notification system in a year's time a 6% reduction in ER visits and a 12% reduction in 30-day readmits. That's for that ACO. And that was in a time frame where the national average of increase of 30-day readmits went up 9%. So a pretty high delta there against the national average. We also have helped generate over $10 million in annual savings from fewer duplicate tests, because so many physicians have access to historical tests. So when a patient goes to an emergency room or they've been incapacitated and they need to see some background information on that patient, they can go into our community health record and not have to order a particular test. Or if a specialist is seeing a patient, they've seen like a recent radiology study, or they can see recent test results from a lab work and not have to order that duplicative lab work. So there's a great savings there. Plus, you're not also, in the case of radiology study, you're not subjecting patients to undue doses of radiation. And, it's still hard to kind of quantify that, but certainly fewer tests for patients is something that they could certainly value. And, of course, we've been credited with helping to our public health organization identify detection of the H1N1 virus. Perhaps our greatest commodity isn't data, but it's trust. Because if you lose the trust with any of our stakeholders or with consumers, basically it doesn't matter much else what we do. So us, like other organizations that are charged with the sacrosanct duty of protecting healthcare information and the rights of patients, must employ best practices and industry standards to eliminate as much risk as we can and manage risk where we can eliminate it. Industry standards like encrypting those 2 types of data that Shahid had referenced earlier, the data that's at rest and the data at motion, they must be encrypted at all times. Applying best practices as an organization in terms of managing information, managing change, and change protocols, such as those that are commonly applied through ITIL foundations. Our organization is 100% ITIL certified. Well, I'll say this, 26 out of the 28 of us have been ITIL Foundation certified. 2 of them will be by the end of the month. Privacy and security best practices like those incorporated through HITRUST and HITRUST protocols, which are a priority of insurance companies throughout the nation, requiring their IT vendors to be HITRUST certified. We are in the process, and it looks real good right now, that we should be, within the next few days, receiving our certification of being high trust certified as an organization. And we think we're going to be the first HIE in the country that can make that claim. The other thing that's important that we do is not just provide products and services for physicians, but also for consumers, and that helps to promote transparency. We are piloting a patient portal. It's not just the type of portal where you can just enter information, but it will provide the clinical information at the hands and fingertips of patients, so they can have access to the same information that their clinical teams have access to, the access to their information on the community health record. And they can also use this tool to communicate securely, safely, using direct messaging tools with any members of their care team. Again, facilitating communication and facilitating engagement with the patient's data, which is a big part for patients becoming, making better decisions in their healthcare and helping to reduce the cost of healthcare, which is such a big, critical problem. The other tool that we have launched, and then I'll wrap things up here, is a product called Health Check Alert. You've probably heard me speak about this last year. This is our SMS texting platform, where we are piloting with our Medicaid office a program where enrolled members can receive a text anytime somebody looks up their information in the community health record, so that they know who's looking at their information when a clinician or a staff member accesses that information, as well as get a text when a lab result has been identified. So if you've seen an oncologist and you're on pins and needles about a test being delivered, you would get an alert that test has been delivered to that practice. No medical information is included in that. It's just an alert saying your doctor has it. Please give them 24 to 48 hours to review your results. You should be hearing something from them soon. It also gives an alert when you've been admitted to the emergency room or as an inpatient to the hospital. Well, if I've been admitted to the emergency room or as an inpatient to the hospital, I probably don't need an alert. The value of that is what if that's not you? As fraud is a big issue in the Medicaid and certainly Medicare circles, as well as with several commercial paying organizations, insurance companies. Fraud, waste, and abuse is one of those areas where if we can make material impact, we can bring down the cost of healthcare. And we see this as an important way for us to do that. So when folks receive that alert on their phone that they've been admitted to the hospital and they're sitting in their family room, they just simply respond to that text, and an alert goes back to that Medicaid or to that health insurance organization. And that also has a patient safety component as well, because if somebody's misrepresenting themselves as you in the hospital and they're getting tests done and the hospital doesn't realize that that's not you, well, later on when you go to that same hospital, or a provider may be looking at your results and maybe be making some clinical decisions based on those results. So we're very excited about the potential for both patient engagement as well as for the potential to make a material impact in terms of fraud, waste, and abuse in the healthcare ecosystem. So, yep, that's basically our position as what we'd like to think is a nationally leading health information exchange, balancing the risks to maximize the benefits associated with this type of operation. Thank you.
Thanks, Randy. That was a good introduction to what a state-of-the-art HIE today is. And now we'll have Adrian discuss what that means for the patient.
Yes, it's a tough job to be on this panel and channel the patient perspective that the title promises. I'll try to be as much focused on that as I can. And I'm going to just have about 2 minutes worth of remarks. I like to read things because I'm not a particularly good speaker unless I'm dealing with questions, as you may know. Here's the way I like to think about HIE, work that I've done for quite well over a decade now. From the patient perspective, it needs to be about outcome and not about process. And most of the way HIEs are conceived now are, from the patient perspective, just process issues. just like any other administrative services that have taken over our healthcare system. They're not about access to actual services that the patient seeks. Why were they invented? Do banks or education, in other words, other personal service industries, need exchanges? I don't see exactly why that should be. U.S. healthcare has a value problem and a disparities problem, again, from the patient's perspective. Value is dependent on quality outcome and cost outcome. Have HIEs, as they are currently conceived, done anything for either? Or are they effectively a way of competing, of protecting the incumbents from competition, from innovation in whatever their market happens to be? There are certainly experts here who might address some of these issues from, again, from their institutional perspective. Disparities in U.S. healthcare are also much greater than other developed economies. Disparities show up as lack of access, inappropriate use of ERs, lack of preventive services, ... Do health information exchanges help manage disparity, or do they hide it behind their relevant process? We have a transparency problem, and HIEs, I would claim, are actually making it worse. The social determinants of health are some of the best predictors of the outcome and the cost of any particular individual's treatment. But our location, financial situation, communication patterns, text messages, our friends and contacts are way too private to be trusted to an HIE or to the EHRs that are pretty much the sole source of their data. And I could take a poll as to how many people in this room would trust any of these social determinants of health to any institutional system in healthcare that we have today. So my claim would be, from the patient perspective, we need transparency of quality and cost and access to health services. Health information exchanges, at least the one I'm involved in Massachusetts, are entirely designed to serve the institutions that they are concerned about from the process perspective. And I literally mean that 100% in the way when I participate in the committee meetings and whatnot. They provide nothing along the lines of the kind of transparency and being in the loop, as some of us say, that patients actually crave, with small exceptions like the messaging thing that Randy is justifiably very proud of. So I think we need exchanges that are owned by patients and serve patients directly, like your post office or your library.
Thank you, Adrian. We'll have cross-examination later. Josh, can you tell us about the HIEs from Verily's perspective?
Sure. So I should say that while my day job is at Verily, I'm really here in my role as a visiting scientist at the Harvard Medical School Department of Biomedical Informatics. And in that role, I have been working on some projects that focus on patient data access. And I should say, before our National Health IT Standards Committee was shut down in the 21st Century Cures Act, I had an active role there and wound up co-chairing a group called the API Privacy and Security Task Force. So my comments here are really from the perspective of giving patients access to their own data. And like Adrian, I think I'll try to keep my opening remarks brief with the goal of getting to some group discussion, because I think that's where the most interesting interactions happen. But what I will say is that from the patient value perspective, when you do a broad survey of where patients are finding utility in these systems, the outlook can look pretty grim, which is to say you get a situation where we spend a lot of time and effort standing up information exchange services, which are mostly focused on helping organizations, hospitals and clinics, to share data and make them available when they need. Giving patients insight into and access to those systems has in many cases been an afterthought. So on the one hand, it's not shocking that patients aren't seeing a lot of value, but I like to flip this question around and say, from the patient rights perspective, what are the things that at least some patients want to be able to do and ought to be able to do that we might prevent them from doing? And this is where the question of access really comes in. Even if most patients like me don't particularly care to spend their time creating accounts in a portal here and an HIE there and downloading their data and keeping in sync. Even if the process is onerous enough to drive most people away, what do we do about the people who actually want that access, who want to be on top of their own records and keep them in one place, and use the apps and services of their choice? And that's a place where for me, it's much easier to dig in and say, let's understand how a patient's right to access should play out in the technology landscape. And we actually have some very clear guidance from the Office for Civil Rights on the one hand, in terms of what patient access means, and then from the ONC, the Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT, which says very specifically in this next round of meaningful use and EHR certification that's coming up, patients have a right to access their own data using apps that they choose, and they should be able to plug those apps into APIs, which is to say I can configure it so that my app can connect to one or more provider systems, and then expect that my data will flow into those systems. Now, that's been a very challenging prospect from the institutional perspective. Hospitals and clinics look at that and still aren't sure what to do about it. They're now having software delivered to them from the big vendors that support these APIs, and there's apps starting to knock on the door and say, hey, can I request access? If the patient says it's okay, can I fetch these data? And now we're getting to the point where, in some cases, providers have to either say yes and flip the switch and turn it on, or spend a lot of time thinking through their local institutional security and privacy rules to try to decide if that's okay. So from my perspective, I think we're hitting an exciting time here where patients are going to be pushing for more access to their data, and they will be very clearly pushing the boundaries of what provider organizations are comfortable with. Once the technology is in place to make it work, it's going to be more and more challenging, I think, from a regulatory perspective, for providers to say no. And so I'm looking forward to seeing those discussions play out.
Thanks, Josh. Glenn, what does the hospital look like today with respect to the patient?
With regard to the patient being able to access their own data, it's kind of a mess, I would say, and I think that's true everywhere, not just at my hospital. I'm going to be speaking from the perspective of a practicing physician and the chair of the Mass Medical Society, and a little bit as a CMIO at my hospital, where my job is to keep the lights on and keep the access to patient records so that to help physicians and nurses and other clinicians do a better job taking care of patients. It's tricky. At the Mass Medical Society, in our committee where I know Adrian, we had spent a lot of time listening to people complain about EHRs, and I'm not going to do that today because we all have various vulgar terms that we can use to describe EHRs, and I won't repeat any of them here. Suffice it to say, they're disappointing. So what we ended up doing, I came up with this list of things that principles about health information technology that I thought the Mass Medical Society should adopt and support, which they eventually adopted, and we're in the process of trying to educate people, primarily our members, but then other folks as well, about these ideas. And I'll just paraphrase most of the list here. I don't want to bore you all just by reading through it, but basically things like physicians should have direct control over the choice and management of information technology that we use. It should be safe, effective, and efficient. It should support my obligation to put the interests of my patients first. It should support the integrity and autonomy of physicians. It should support the patient's autonomy by providing access to that individual's data. And this is one of my favorites here. There should be no institutional or administrative barriers between physicians and their patients' health data. And information technology should promote the elimination of healthcare disparities. Now, from my view, all of this seems pretty obvious to me. I mean, the whole widget in this business and why we're all here is that a patient shows up and they need help, or they're ill, or they have questions, and that needs to be addressed. That's the point here, and it's the thing that gets lost so often in all of these discussions about health IT, health industry regulation, and so on. It's just an observation that it's an afterthought most of the time that maybe we should have a physician or a nurse or, God forbid, a patient come in to talk about what is it that we all need, what is it that we want, what would be helpful to help me, a physician, deal with this patient here, whether they're ill or they just have questions or whatever it is. So it's that's mainly what we're trying to aim at here with this is removing all the barriers between the clinician, and I'm saying clinician very deliberately, not just physicians, because this is true for nurses, respiratory therapists, dietitians in the hospital, everyone who's involved in trying to assist this patient. Everybody needs access to the record and to have it done in a way that actually helps them do their job. I would argue that in every EHR that I know about and have discussed with people, that pretty much they all fail just on just about all of these principles that I read through here. It's very frustrating, but I am hopeful, though, because we have people like all of you here, and there's been some very brilliant people discussing things here today about potential ways that we can break through these barriers, and so we can really get back to supporting the basic part of this business, which is that someone needs help or has questions or is very ill and needs the assistance of a healthcare professional. That's the business here, and facilitating and supporting that is something that I think we can do a much better job of with health information technology. It's just that the needs of those two groups of people should be the first thought, not an afterthought. Thank you.
Thank you. Just from the FDA perspective, and I can talk about the FDA now because I left. There were 1.5 million adverse drug events last year in the United States alone, and there were millions, uncounted millions, of medical device errors. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you saw the obituary of Dr. Amy Reed in the New York Times. Mm-hmm. But she succumbed to cancer, was an anesthesiologist, underwent surgery with a product called a power morcellator, which spread cancer within her and eventually killed her. No one reported the fact that people were dying from the use of power morcellators. And FDA even checked its records and had to go out to 17 hospitals to find out if anybody had died from power morcellators. If Dr. Amy Reed had not been a physician herself, people would still be dying from power morcellators. And there are endoscope infection cases. There are hundreds of these product issues that were never reported. Mm-hmm. Adrian, the social determination of health and the social determinants of health seem to be extremely important to the treatment of a patient. How is that relevant to HIEs from your perspective?
Well, if we're going to have a system that is not what people have very sadly and politically called death panels, in other words, the idea that healthcare is sort of predetermined on whatever basis, but where value of care and outcomes are individualized, then you also have to have a way of controlling for the difference between two individuals who want to spend, who have different preferences, because you can't blame or you can't penalize the physician or the hospital that does something in the case of one patient that might be considered inefficient. And so as we try to reform healthcare in general and to move to value-based care in order to control costs and to, to reach a state of world-class outcomes compared to other developed economies, we need to have this input in order to drive quality, in order to have transparency of value. And that's the reason. It's not that any doctor is actually going to treat some patient differently as a result of these social determinants of health. It's that the doctor is going to get paid differently, or the hospital or that team is going to get paid differently. And since the economics in our system, at least, this is not political, this is mostly privately done, this becomes hugely important because it directly drives what the physicians are going to do.
Now, Randy, centralization, obviously, of data has its benefits.
Sure.
And we've heard today over and over again about the detriments of centralization of data, particularly in the last panel, which was brilliant.
It sure is.
How do you square that balance?
You know, would we do better to have data decentralized? You know, there are places where that may make sense. But at the end of the day, whether it's centralized or decentralized, it comes down to a matter of like, what is the core reason why you have that data? And it's to serve somebody's need at a point in time when they need help, right? And if you can manage risk better by having things decentralized, okay, but then you've got to apply all those best practices that I talked about with high trust and idle foundations, all those things that then have to be applied in those various buckets. And then you have like that situation like with patient portals, where people have to go through and have 7 different IDs and passwords to get into all their data. I mean, the article that you shared with us made the point that patients are frustrated because they have multiple places to go for their data. They want their data safe, they want their data secure, and they want their data when they want their data and when they need it. So if you know, it comes down to the fact of it's like anything else. I mean, you know, we have to apply due diligence and vigilance in protecting and being true to the cause of what people deserve in the realm of privacy, and at the same time making sure that we make it easy for the people who are in need of that information. When somebody is suffering, when somebody is in need of care, that is right there on demand and ready for them. And if they got to go multiple places and have multiple IDs, and not have the benefits of centralization, you know, people will suffer and lives will be lost. You know, so it's a matter of, I think, just of just applying those standards and those protocols, and having the governance and the regulatory oversight to enable things to be done the right way. And you know, it's just like anything else. I mean, from the dawn of fire, we've benefited from the warmth and the benefits of fire, but boy, there sure are some bad consequences too. You know, so you try and manage it, right?
Okay, so we have about 15 minutes, and I'd like to open it up to questions. Anyone?
I just want you guys to know, Adrian and I had a delightful dinner together last night. Every year he's surprised when I don't show up with horns in the tail.
So I want to just start out with a little personal health, no, nothing real big deal, but when is this on? When I started looking into health IT, and I've been pretty heavily into it for like about 8 years now, I got a note from my daughter's school, okay? And they said, we're going to kick your daughter out of school because you have not returned this signed form saying that she's been vaccinated. And I thought, what? She's been vaccinated? You know, I'm a typical middle-class parent. Of course all that stuff's done. How did that message not get over to the school? And why is the school nurse bugging me? I said, I'm an IT guy. I can figure this out. This should take me like a week. And I went, oh, jeez. I ended up talking to the state vaccine database administrator who said, well, can you send an HL7 version 2 message to us? And I went, oh, man, really? So just to skip forward in time, she was in high school. She just graduated from NYU at the Tisch program. And her senior thesis that she did is a brassiere that detects breast cancer, okay? And her other project that goes along with it, it's kind of like a TED Talk thing that they have to do there, is DIY GYN, which involves a Tor network where they're taking pictures that would correspond, like you would take any picture of your body, and sending it out to physicians and so on and so forth. That's her. And it's more about how she says, well, we really shouldn't have to do this. So in terms of access and getting the data at the right time to the right person, it seems like we have all these tools that's right that the patient has. They could get a medical device. She was able to build a bra that detects cancer. It wasn't that hard, actually. And on the speculation side, she was to get the other tools which were invented back in the 1860s in terms of being able to do GYN. So, but what does she have that's different? An iPhone, right? And where's the technical connection? Well, it's being able to send it over the Tor network to keep it private. So why can't this come from the patient to the doctor? Why do I have to go through HL7 in order to send in a permission slip for the fact that the vaccine was done?
Sure. So from my perspective, those kinds of data flows are exactly what we need more of in healthcare. I mean, I wouldn't put too much emphasis on the form or the format, whether the message that's coming through is an HL7 version 2 message that was designed in 1990, or whether it's an HL7 FHIR resource that was designed in 2013, or whether it's just an image file and presumably some metadata going over the wire. That's just describing, hey, here's some information, here's a question I'm asking. Someone on the other side needs to have a process in place to receive it and deliver care. And in our environment today, that means providers meeting record-keeping obligations, being able to bill appropriately for their services. There's a fair amount of workflow that goes into it, but we get very hung up on the data exchange and on securing that data exchange, even when in cases where the security is almost arbitrary. I mean, I've read a 100-page implementation guide for one clinical system to query another one and say, do you have a summary document for me? If so, I would like it, please. And that could just be like a single HTTP request, maybe with an authorization header in there to make it work. But instead, there were multiple different organizations involved, huge consultancies and multinational companies that were providing token services and authenticators and validators, and you had to go through, literally the number of steps was obscene. A lot of this comes from an organizational perspective, trying to figure out, what are the risks, and doing a lot of compliance work. Frankly, the amount of compliance work that an organization needs to meet dwarfs the technical work, to the point where organizations make technical decisions based on how easy it will be to demonstrate compliance rather than what would be an appropriate technical choice. That's very common today. And frankly, I like to see more of the examples that you're describing here, which is, let's pretend for a moment that we could hit the reset button and ask, how would we actually do things if we were starting from scratch? What are the security properties? Because in many cases, the security properties of those systems are better than what we have on the ground that checks all of the compliance checkboxes. They're just not as well understood by the institutions who have been working in this paradigm for a long time.
I just want to make a very quick comment. We should take other questions, but what Josh is talking about from my perspective is a very different problem. It's the problem of regulatory capture, which is that institutions that have an economic interest in not sharing the data will focus either through how they structure the various committees and policies in such a way to specifically prevent that physician, like Glenn, from having a safe harbor for sharing immunization records with Peter. They will go, and they have gone through about 10 years worth by inventing things like direct trust and other very expensive accreditation mechanisms And we don't have time for Josh to go into the work he did with the API task force, where he mentioned this idea that the patient has the right and the physician has the ability, as Glenn put in his principles, to do this without institutional interference. And just like somebody said earlier about everybody in that, there don't need to be exceptions. OCR has said there don't have to be exceptions to giving that physician a safe harbor. The institution does not need to have a vote here.
Yeah, I would just like to add that this is an example of something that is so simple, it is so easy, it is so straightforward. This is a no-brainer. This is something that a fourth grader could do. Can you find this piece of paper, or we're trying to get away from paper. Here I am committing my own gripe that haven't made the transition to digital yet. Sorry, everyone. Can we get this record and send it to this person over here? This is very, very easy. This is very simple. You know, we always talk about, and Adrian hit on a point here, that, you know, we always talk about how complex all the regulations are, and Josh was talking about it as well, and that you have to demonstrate compliance and you have to go through all these, you know, hundreds of hoops about to be able just to send this simple document that everybody knows that you have to have. This isn't a secret. It's not hard. But, you know, the barriers to it are more institutional and lack of willingness to allow access to make it easier for people, because I need to guard my data. I need to make it hard for people to get to because it's valuable, as we have been learning, you know, all day long here. I think that's one of the major barriers to it, because, you know, if I can log into a website that is affiliated with my institution about our retirement plan, I can log in there, I can make a change to something that will change the amount of money that comes out of my paycheck every week, and I'm happy with it, the IRS is happy with it, the Securities and Exchange Commission is happy with it, my hospital is happy with it, the state, you know, the Commonwealth Department of the Treasury is happy with it, all of these big government institutions that are highly regulated, everybody's happy with it, and it's not a big deal. It takes me about 30 seconds, but you can't get a copy of your daughter's immunization record. That's absurd.
So well said, absolutely. So actually our Health Check Connect product, we're currently working with the Delaware Division of Public Health to enable the connection of immunization information into our product. So when somebody enrolls, they'll be able to pull up their immunization records. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I hear what you're saying. I traverse those retirement websites or the fund websites, and I feel the same way. And Adrian, you said a really interesting thing earlier about like how financial services doesn't really have like an HIE, but I think the credit bureaus kind of are a fair analogy for that. They all feed the credit bureaus, and then commerce is driven off of the information off of the credit bureaus, and are highly regulated and whatnot. And I think the HIEs kind of drive that parallel, and with the proper governance, with the proper regulation and oversight, they can do the kinds of things that you're talking about and have these sort of one-stop shops that can help people fill the gaps that they need to have filled and bring convenience and not make people jump through hoops to just have their kids play sports.
4 minutes.
Okay, now I'm afraid to ask the question. In the last few months, there have been a couple of court cases where we still have document companies still going to court, charging patients and their attorneys different fees, even though the patient has authorized the attorney as a representative to get the records. And I mention that only because one thing we haven't talked about, and usually when I hear conversations about this, we never hear it talked about, is that patients have other reasons other than health care to want to access their records. I mean, we heard this announced to get to school. I would point out to you that one of the most frequent, or not frequent, but often is, I want to sue for malpractice, I want to get my records, and I want to get records now. And so I'm wondering, as we talk about this, where you think other uses of data, and whether your HIE actually allows for the collection of data that may be used in litigation, because there are exceptions and different ways of charging more or giving access to for litigation, and that triggers all sorts of other things. But that is a common reason for that, and something that patients really have a deep concern about.
The M word. Anyone want to address the M
Yes,
word?
yes, I would. I think that most of the time when patients want access to their records, that is not for purposes of litigation. They're curious. They want to know. They want to double check something.
Well, I wasn't suggesting it was, but there is that common.
Right. But this is the fear that everybody talks about that causes us to put up more barriers between patients and their own data. And frequently, I think that's not the reason why people want it. They're curious. They want to know. If I don't send a patient a letter about the blood test results when they came in to see me, I tell them they need to call, or you need to go on the portal. You need to look. It might have slipped by without me seeing it. These kinds of errors happen. I'm not infallible. You're the last, stop of safety here. This is about you. I do the best I can, but sometimes things get missed. So there's a whole dialogue about this. I'm getting a little bit away from our questions here, but it's about engagement. It's about talking. It's a back and forth. It's not really a one-time office visit. It's building a relationship. It's building trust. It's having a dialogue about the health, which can include, hey, I'd like a copy of my note from today. Sure, give me a minute and I'll finish it up. I mean, that's, for one thing, it's the law anyway. And for another, it's easy to do. I mean, why, I understand that, the fear of malpractice is what drives a lot of what I would call, sorry for all the physicians in the room, paranoid behavior on my profession's part. But, it's just not, it's not a realistic worry most of the time. I think people are curious. They want to know, they want to double check, they want to learn.
I would add that cost is something that we really haven't addressed here, and it is a fundamental issue.
Well, my point is there are laws that require, one, previous notice, for instance, before you can even file suit for malpractice, which is then going to necessitate asking for records. Then there's the whole attorneys getting involved in that. And as I say, even if you take that apart, there are other reasons other than for healthcare purposes. And I'm not arguing your point that it's what happens when you let the free market rather than have a coordinated, efficient way of creating standards for this happens. This is why we get here. But it's just the conversation always goes to the primary reason we have this, which is the sharing of health data for the provision of healthcare services. But it's not the only reason, and I never hear that being discussed. And while, yes, it is a concern about being sued and the paranoia about that, I would just like to see do EHR systems even contemplate other uses of the data outside of research or the provision of healthcare? And that's really more where I'm going with this.
Thank you. We've run out of time. And I want to thank the panel. I want to apologize to Josh for calling him old and crusty. He was hiding.
I'm getting there, don't worry.
He was hiding behind Adrian there. Thank you again.
What?
Are you in town for other stuff?
I meant to be in town for this at least, and I wound up having so many meetings lined up this morning. This just turned out to be a crazy week. This is the week that the Precision Medicine Initiative is recruiting our first participant, and everything was supposed to be coming together.
Lucia?
The usual launch time challenges.
Okay.
Upstairs.
And I actually know work at a
Wound up getting some work done there.
so maybe you guys will that too, but
Okay.
after I left LC, I took the opportunity to try to get my data twice. Oh my God, it was such a nightmare. I actually filed a complaint against my insurance company, OCR. Josh, don't leave. I was actually in my doctor's office, and it was a 45-minute explaining asking them why were they screenshotting my version of my chart, which is a great, because then I couldn't get the data in it to anyone else. So they're like, oh. I'm like, I can download it and print it on my laptop. Why can't I get it off my phone? And they're like, oh, I'm going to raise that with our Epic sponsor. I keep thinking, I've finished my work. But
It's made it, there's been improvements for sure.
Check, check, 1, 2.
Worst case, I can ask some people in the audience if they have one. Yeah. I mean, you know, I'm happy to take it. I might just say I lead the MIT Provost of Computer Protection, dynamics of agreement and public health. And the best thing we chat about that. And based on that, and welcome reception, yeah. And when we chat about welcome reception, based on that, talked about how to separate height. That's what I decided I would do, which I think might be better than talking about.
Yes. Okay, are you ready? Okay, this is the end of the day, but we have, you're not even going to believe how wonderful Prakash is. This is a real treat, and he is a superstar in the AI world, which we're not going to get into. He wants me to tell you that he is the head of MIT's probabilistic computing lab, and what he's going to talk about is the.
All right, I got it.
All right, he's going to let him do it himself. I'm just so. He's just so impressive. It's difficult to even know what to say about him. So, okay. We can't say this about every computer scientist, but this one is super, super special, and I hope he'll be with us every year. So, please.
Okay. Thank you. So I'm new to this group. But when I was chatting with Deb at the welcome reception, I decided I would change my talk a little bit on the basis of that conversation. I hope it's maybe more helpful for you as a result. My goal is really going to be to help us first maybe debunk some of the hype around artificial intelligence. So I'm going to start just by trying to highlight, I hope intuitively, some of the gaps between our own capacity to think and the significant but still limited progress that AI has made. And then against that backdrop, I want to talk a little bit about some new technology around AI that I don't think is likely to be familiar to this group, that I think highlights both some of the risks of artificial intelligence around health privacy, as well as some interesting opportunities that I'm hoping to get feedback from you on it all about at the end. So let's get started. So the field of AI has historically measured its progress by its ability to build systems that can beat top performing people at their own game. So I remember Deep Blue's victory over Garry Kasparov when I was a high school student. More recently, we saw Watson beat Ken Jennings at Jeopardy, and AlphaGo, built by Google DeepMind, which very recently defeated the actual world champion at Go. And I think these are legitimately treated as landmarks in the advance of artificial intelligence. However, I think it's also really important to recognize how these successes speak to the limitations of AI technology. Consider that pretty much any high school kid can learn how to play chess, Go, and Jeopardy. But it would be an enormous crash research project that would probably fail to try to get Watson to extract the rules of chess from a manual. Right? And AlphaGo can't parse English. So there's a lot of exuberance about AI, and I think especially in the health field, it's useful to focus a little bit on Watson. So how many of you guys have been in some role that you're in bombarded with sort of the success or the relevance of AI for transforming health? Okay, so a reasonable fraction. How many of you found yourselves pretty skeptical? Good. Many of you who weren't bombarded raised your hand. Good. Okay, good. So, this trope that AI systems are smarter than anything else on the planet is an old one, and it's actually an old one even in IBM's marketing. So, for example, this is an ad from the 60s for one of IBM's first computers. And it says, the IBM 650 magnetic drum data processing machine has been built for commercial use. And it's a giant brain that's going to obsolete thought work, knowledge work by some fraction of people. And, in some areas of the press, I think this exuberance can get just a little exaggerated, right? It's like the real promise of big data is it's going to change the whole way that humans solve problems. There's also a lot of fear around AI. So I remember going to a dinner in New York, and I mentioned that I work in AI at MIT, and the first question one of the guests asked me was, "So, Vikash, how scared should I be?" And at first I was kind of taken aback, I didn't understand. And then I started just sort of looking at what had been in the popular press around that time, and I found this highly reassuring headline: "Out of control AI will not kill us, believes Microsoft research chief." And then his sort of arguably distant boss saying, "I don't understand why some people aren't concerned." And my lab's worked with the Gates Foundation for a few years, actually, applying some of the AI technology we build to some of their public health problems. I'll talk about that later. But I think it's actually striking that you see leadership of many organizations that are heavily involved in AI research also in this kind of uncomfortable state, not knowing, what's hype, what's real opportunity, what's risk. And I see that in the investing community as well. My lab's at MIT, but I do a little bit of tech entrepreneurship as well. And this sort of mix seems pretty widespread. And you see books talking about legitimate changes to the workforce that are really challenging very old economic assumptions, all the way through to books that could not paint a grimmer picture. Okay. So to step back from that fear, I think one way to get some perspective is again to go back to Watson. So I'm showing Watson along with Dave Ferrucci. Watson's the principal designer, and Watson is indeed better than Dave at Jeopardy. But Watson can only play Jeopardy. And Watson consumes about 80 kilowatts of power and has processing elements that are clocked at around 3 gigahertz. Right? So that means they make a very large number of transitions every second inside the chips inside Watson. Whereas Dave's brain makes state transitions much more slowly, and he can function all day on a cheeseburger. So human intelligence is both far more flexible and creative than machine intelligence thus far, and also staggeringly more efficient. Narrowing this gap is one of the main research themes in my lab, and I think depending on how you count, there may be 6 or 7 orders of magnitude in terms of power, performance. If you take the product of measures of power and performance, there may be 6 to 7 orders of magnitude of gap by some measures between neural computation and the chips that Intel makes. And our most successful proposals we think might narrow that by 2 or 3, maybe. And those are still quite radical. Okay, despite that, there have been real changes. So one way to look at these changes is first, let's start with what hasn't changed. So the basic conceptual vocabulary around data hasn't really changed over the last few decades. Right, so the modern data environment was enabled by the relational database, and the basic usage patterns around it have been constant for decades. However, the fact that that picture on the right is on an iPad and in color actually matters. Right, so it's much easier to get access to the information that you can describe conceptually with a simple SQL query today than it was a few decades ago. And that does have the potential to be transformative, and that creates new risks. So that is absolutely a legitimate change. Not really an AI change per se. I'd argue the AI shift was from the pre-database era to the database era. The cost of storage has decreased by many, many orders of magnitude. And the cost of computation has decreased. So you can't see the numbers, but the y-axis is measuring dollars. It's plotted on a log scale. The x-axis is years. And the dots correspond to specific computing machines. But they're showing how much did it cost to have computing power equal to an iPad 2. Right, so back in the days of ENIAC, it was $1 trillion. Okay, so there really have been quantitative changes that lead to some qualitative effects, and I think it's, I'm sort of trying to help give you guys a little bit of detail for understanding this picture, because I think, although there isn't a cocktail party summary of it, I think it's an important part of the puzzle for understanding what the real risks and opportunities of AI are today. Okay, so it's not the case that we have more intelligent algorithms that learn somehow like the brain, or like people do, or like the mind. But it is the case that we have far more modern system software, depending on how you count, 100 to 10,000x more data and compute for typical applications, and that this means that simple calculations work a lot better now. And that's especially true for calculations that are in service of statistical modeling. And that has given rise to some interesting AI advances. But it hasn't given rise to AI. Right? So we've got component technologies that can do pattern recognition, identify faces and everyday objects and images, help you find people solve various sensory motor intelligence problems as you need to do autonomous driving, find documents. But all of these are very narrow component technologies. So I just want to spend a minute maybe just trying to remind us all about how far these capabilities are from intelligence. And as an AI researcher, I actually believe in the potential of AI to reveal something about our own intelligence and maybe someday to surpass it. I just want to point out how far we are. So, historically, there are maybe three main proposals for how to build intelligence out of simple kinds of calculation. One of them is to do statistics. These days you do statistics on a grand scale, but it's essentially, very simple kinds of dimensionality reduction or regression. Then there was logical deduction. And actually both databases and hardware verification, the whole hardware verification industry. So designing computer chips, none of that would work without the ability to do very sort of logic on a grand scale. And then there's heuristic search, which you could think of as like, when AlphaGo or Deep Blue sort of explores this vast space of possible moves. It's partly guided by statistical models, but it's partly guided by technology for how to do search of very large spaces. These are three very, very old intellectual proposals for what intelligence might be that, existing computing machinery has helped us implement and scale up. But our intelligence is not just about pattern recognition or logic or search. So at minimum, it's also about modeling the world. So that includes explaining and understanding what we see, imagining things we could see but haven't seen yet, being able to solve problems and plan using these models, and building new models as we learn more about the world. And in fact, mature intelligence also requires the ability to model the strength and limitations of our models. Right? To sort of know something about when we know something and when we don't know something. So these are all aspects of intelligence that are, I might say, just at best barely present in state-of-the-art AI systems. Unfortunately, if you see the marketing language around AI products, it's I think, disappointingly common to see claims made to these kinds of capabilities. But there, if I put on my hat of somebody who sometimes does diligence in this sector, I can say it's not true. The software can't actually do that. If it could, I would tell you about it. And if you'll permit me to be philosophical for a moment, so my lab's actually housed in a brain and cognitive sciences department. There's some really brilliant writing on what the nature of an explanation is that I think is actually relevant for us understanding what potential AI has to help improve medical care. So in a book from the 40s called The Nature of Explanation, I'll just read the sections in blue. If an organism carries a small-scale model of external reality and of its own possible actions within its head, it's able to try out various alternatives, conclude which is the best of them, react to future situations before they arise, utilize the knowledge of past events in dealing with the present and the future, and in every way react in a much fuller, safer, and more competent manner. So that sounds nice. For many applications in medical care, if we could actually equip our software with enough intelligence and ground that intelligence in the available empirical data and do so in a way that we felt was supportive of human values and some of the principles around privacy and empowerment we've seen discussed here. And I'm very interested in research that can help bring us closer to that. Okay, so maybe one or two last points about AI hype versus reality before we start talking about some new or emerging AI technology that I think is relevant. So I think there's often a discussion in AI and machine learning around the difference between black box modeling and interpretable modeling. Or at least a critique that's offered of machine learning or AI systems, that they are black box, that they produce outputs that demand an explanation. I'm sympathetic to this, but I think here it may be helpful, especially in this community, to recognize that this problem is not new to AI, and there's a model for it in existing software. So, computer chips can be specialized to particular problems. Like a physical chip that's, an application-specific integrated circuit is maybe useful to think of as like the paradigm case of a black box. It's like you have it, you can put in problems, you can get out answers, and it takes an enormous amount of equipment to even see the physical structure that's performing the computation, and that won't tell you anything about the internal logic by which the answer is is coming out. So it's actually far easier to reverse engineer than a mind or brain of a person solving the same problem, but it's still almost, impossibly opaque. But the way that chips are designed is you start with very high-level ideas that you translate into software, and you maybe run them on a processor, or you start making custom hardware for them. And as you move from that very high-level description down to a low-level description, you move from a version of the problem that's evolvable, inspectable, communicable between people, but slow, to one that you can make machines that do very efficiently and in low power, but that's opaque. So there's this intrinsic trade-off between inspectability, evolvability, communicability on the one hand, and certain kinds of specialization or performance on the other. And you can actually see this in biological evolution, arguably, as well. I'm not an expert on that, so I don't want to go into it too much, but happy to talk about it offline. In any case, we're also seeing that tension in AI. So I say this because when we hear discussions of a right to an explanation or the desire for more interpretable output from our AI systems, my response, while on the one hand I'm sympathetic, I also find myself sometimes feeling like that request really ought to apply equally well to the opaque black boxes of human decision makers, or socio-technical systems, or existing software that doesn't have the technical complexity of like a whole lot of regression weights or some big neural network that is sort of obviously opaque. There are many other decision-making systems we depend on that are essentially opaque or that disempower us maybe just as deeply. Okay. And this is an issue I'm very interested in, happy to talk about offline. That said, I want to point out that there is a lab that I did not see represented here at Harvard. So I have no collaborations with this lab, but I want to mention them because I think they're very relevant for your community. The PI is Finale Doshi Velez. The lab is the Harvard Data to Actionable Knowledge Lab. And Finale is one of the smartest young academics I've met in general, but also doing incredibly creative work applying probabilistic AI techniques that strike different trade-offs between interpretability and performance to very messy clinical problems. And unlike many AI researchers, she's actually learning the medicine. And sort of the research is conducted from a posture of basic respect for domain knowledge in medicine as opposed to the premise that it could somehow be automated away. So I think it ought to be very relevant for this community. Okay, good. So I'm about half done, which is perfect. So let's talk a little bit about some new technology that I think, may help us frame some of the problems around applying AI to health data a little bit more sharply and create some new risks and possibilities. Okay, so my lab sort of really doesn't focus so much on artificial intelligence, that is beating top performing people at their own game, but augmented intelligence, so building AI systems that can collaborate closely with people. And by people here, I mean, for example, in my entrepreneurial hats, it might be business decision makers. But in my research hats, it's more like clinicians, visual designers, and AI researchers. And so the idea is you want to have AI systems that can work in conjunction with a human supervisor, act as a kind of intelligent assistant. And that means you don't just want to put in features and get an answer out, but you want to have the human be able to give guidelines, questions, and hints in some language that can describe their incomplete knowledge of the problem they're trying to solve. And the AI assistant needs to be able to hand back partial solutions in some cases with some notion of uncertainty. And if you have that, if you have languages for that kind of communication, then the human-machine team can solve problems that really neither kind of intelligence could on its own. So I think there's an enormous need for AI software that works with people in this way. So, my lab's done a little bit of work with the Gates Foundation, which is a very interesting organization, I think, for a number of reasons. But one of them is that they have such a broad range of data sources, partly because they fund primary data collection internationally, and a network of consultants and domain experts in many fields. But for very basic questions around which they're doing policy advocacy, there's a real lack of agreement on this fundamental science that creates huge roadblocks for credible policy advocacy. So, for example, let's say this is a slightly modified example from one that came up, but I think it'll help make the point. There's some people who believe that a certain type of vitamin A administered, actually, how should I put it? So there's some studies that argue that you can save lives by giving kids vitamin A in a certain form at the right time. But those only seem to work in some parts of the world and not others. That is, the studies so far seem to suggest that it works in some places but not others. And the people who ran these studies don't really, to the best of my knowledge, know why that is. It turns out that the World Health Organization apparently is unwilling to make policy distinctions without a biological mechanism, so not willing to do it geographically. That's considered phenomenological, and therefore just somehow not really public health or world health. And, for some interventions, they could be costly or difficult. So now you have this interesting question, which is the Gates Foundation leadership is meeting with people who are empowered to maybe carry out an experiment or test an intervention in some area, and they need to argue that they should do it on the basis of a study that was done elsewhere. How do they argue that it's going to be generalizable or worth the cost? Right? So that's a type of problem that they have many, many versions of. And the human expertise is too inconsistent to sort of necessarily lead to like persuasive arguments in all the cases where they think their data somehow or their knowledge ought to be able to yield clear recommendations. These are the kinds of problems we've been trying to help them with. And there are real technical challenges that these problems expose. So the first is there's, I think, an unappreciated replication crisis in data analysis. So there's a really brilliant study which finally did a controlled experiment where they said, let's give 29 teams the same data set in question. In this case, whether soccer referees are more likely to give red cards to dark skin tone players than light skin tone players. And it turns out that the answers are across the spectrum. So, 20 teams found a statistically significant positive effect and 9 teams observed a non-significant relationship. Just to be clear, right, these are all qualified analysts, the data set and the question's the same. But as anybody here who's done quantitative analysis knows, there are so many small judgment calls that go into formulating the analysis plan and applying it. That's maybe not surprising that you see a range of responses. Right, so credible inference requires good statistical judgment, and that's especially the case as you move away from very simple experimental designs into a regime where you have missing values and mixed types of data, and the data is quote-unquote uncleaned, and where you have inferential challenges, like you're studying a heterogeneous phenomenon, so maybe there's few real replicates, like in almost any kind of medical treatment, right? There's just so many uncontrolled covariates, you have convenience samples, and maybe even just fundamentally limited causal knowledge, right? So these facts of reality of data and inference drive, I think, a lack of replicability in data analysis. And this, in turn, can drive a lack of credibility. So, when I'm teaching MIT students about data analysis, I often start by reminding them that Churchill famously said, "I only believe in statistics that I doctored myself." And I find myself arguing it's not because Churchill was innumerate. It's actually that I think many decision makers have learned to be mistrustful of data analysis that doesn't qualitatively confirm what they believe to be true. Because that lack of confirmation is evidence that the analysis may not be credible, which of course makes it very difficult to study issues that are truly controversial. And what you actually see, and I've seen this borne out absolutely, when I've been in my tech entrepreneurship hat, is that executives in more mature industries with respect to data analysis have a deeper distrust of data analysis. You see, in life sciences and finance, it's actually like the deepest executive distrust of data analysis, which I think is great, actually. That, to me, feels healthy. But also, I think, helps to sort of highlight a problem, which is despite these vast data resources, there's still some fundamental disconnect. I don't believe that training more or better statisticians is a viable solution. So here, I may end up in an argument with colleagues of mine who are statisticians, not Andrew. Andrew's great, about this issue, and in general, actually. Andrew helped inspire the AI system I'm going to talk about later on. So he's, some of you may have encountered him because he's, I think, maybe the only statistician on the planet to have a blog that's read by like many tens of thousands of people. It's like, I think it's about 30,000 readers or something. It's a statistics blog. And he says statistics is hard like basketball. We have to accept statistical incompetence not as an aberration, but as the norm. And I think that's just the truth. It's also the case, as I was talking about recently with my dean of undergraduate education, that especially for problems which are about applying data analysis in the public interest, there's going to be an enormous gap of skills because data scientists just recently overtook various kinds of software engineer as the most demanded job on Glassdoor. And you see like the starting compensation here is like 110,000. These are for people out of undergrad. So of course, people who are trying to, improve, let's say, apply this stuff to data from the New England Innocence Project or the ACLU or, any of these sort of, they can't get access to the same pool of candidates to do the work. Okay, so that sets the stage for BaseDB, which is this AI system, open source AI system my lab's been working on for about 10 years. It's one of our probabilistic programming platforms. And BaseDB tries to provide AI assistance for data science so that domain experts can ask and answer questions, maybe in seconds or minutes, and get answers of a quality that compares with what they would have gotten if they had a consulting statistician, and for each question, they gave that statistician, a day or something like that to go do some statistical programming and whatever. So we want to build an AI system that can do in seconds or minutes what currently takes hours or days for someone with good statistical judgment and some statistical programming skills. Two of the companies I've been involved with have commercialized corners of BaseDB, really the corners that focus on descriptive and exploratory data analysis, so where you're trying to understand the data. A lot of our current research focuses on, moving through prediction to a little bit more causal and mechanistic understanding. And it's all open source, and the papers are all online, and there's nothing proprietary about BaseDB. So what do I mean by data science? So this is something that may help this community in particular. How many of you have seen Drew Conway's blog post that gives the data science Venn diagram? Okay, a couple of people. Great. So I think this is a useful map, which says that data science lies at the intersection of programming, statistics, and domain knowledge. And if you don't actually have all three of those, you're doing something else. So you could be doing machine learning. Many of my papers are in machine learning conferences. And machine learning is great, but it works really when the data is cheap and the task is repeated and the errors are inconsequential. So, predicting clicks, or likes, sort of like a great example of that. It could be that if what you have is domain knowledge and statistics expertise, then you're doing traditional quantitative research, which works great when you have simple data sets and tried and true experimental designs that don't expose the data or inference challenges I was mentioning earlier. A big problem is that you need domain knowledge, but if all you have is domain knowledge, or domain knowledge and programming ability, you're in one of these danger zones, where it becomes very tempting to try to conclude things from data that may not bear out. Although I think I could just as well have colored some of the other circles red, right? They're just, the dangers are different, right? Okay, so BaseDB provides AI assistance for data science. So what do I mean by that? Let me just give you this one simple example. On the right, there's like an architecture diagram for BaseDB, and on the left, there's like a little transcript with it, just on a little toy problem. So let's say you had a CSV file of information about customers. Well, so you can sort of talk to BaseDB in a conceptual vocabulary that tries to mirror what maybe an idealized statistician would be doing in their head. Right? So not what you currently tell a statistician, but what the statistician's somehow doing in their head. Right? So you might tell BaseDB, create a population, which is like a representation of the conceptual population of interest, which goes beyond the data you've actually seen. Guess the statistical types and override the type for age. You know, treat it as a magnitude, can't be negative. Then create a thing called a meta model using some baseline crosscat thing, which, you know, in a longer talk I would spend some time on. But make sure to use linear regression to predict income given age and state. Then initialize 4 models, which you can sort of think of as, imagine 4 independent statisticians doing this analysis. Give them each a minute. Well, and there's some multiplier, right? So, you know, just like AlphaGo can play 1,000 games of Go in a day, but it learns much less from each game than a human does. You know, BaseDB can, you know, it learns a lot less from each encounter with the data than a human statistician does, but, you know, you can clone it on the cloud and it can play, you know, millions of data analysis games if you like at a time, or, you know, in a day. And then you can say simulate age and state given income, and you get back a synthetic data table, which is generated data from an ensemble of models that reflects the consensus or lack thereof of these little virtual statisticians that did the analysis. Okay, so that's sort of the basic concept for BaseDB. There's a lot of technical challenges in making this work, and there's lots of papers. They're all online. You can read about them. Actually, my student Faraz Saad has written a bunch of papers on this stuff recently that I'm very proud of him for. I just want to acknowledge the technical challenges because BaseDB has some capabilities that I think are a bit surprising. And so, you know, that means that one has to ask skeptically, like, you know, how could we do that? So the biggest technical challenge was, how do you go from messy data to ensembles of baseline probabilistic models that are not total BS? And that was something we spent about 10 years on. But there's also problems like, how do you let users customize the modeling approach and put in more of their knowledge if they have it, which you've been working on over the last couple years? And then how do you define a language for asking questions that lets you expand on the types of questions you would normally ask a statistician in English, and, you know, but instead ask this AI system? And, you know, the vision for BaseDB at a place like the Gates Foundation is to create an AI-mediated conversation between policy advocates, domain experts, field researchers, statisticians, and the data itself, right? Where each of them can express parts of what they know and parts of what they're interested in knowing in these languages, but rely on the AI to sort of try to mediate the conversation and ground it in the empirical data and reflect back the uncertainty that's associated with those inferences. And we're not there yet, but I think we're making good progress. And we actually just started analyzing data from the Mimic 3 project, which gives academics at a few institutions access to a particular electronic health record. So let me just show you 1 or 2 example queries, just so you see what results actually look like before we wrap up. And I'll end with just some research questions I have for this group. So a lot of this work was funded by DARPA. One of the databases we applied BaseDB to was a database of satellites. And here I'm showing one satellite, which, because it was funded by DARPA, happens to be a Chinese defense satellite. And, you know, we've got variables like what country is it from, you know, what's its purpose, what's its launch mass or dry mass, what are the kinematic properties of the satellite's orbit, so various variables. And this is a visual representation of the data, and by the way, the red indicates, so the rows are satellites and the columns are variables, and the color indicates the value, but red means missing, right? So this is an actual database, you can tell, because a lot of the values are red, right? So one question you can ask BaseDB is, imagine I had a satellite in geosynchronous orbit with a dry mass of 500 kilograms. Who's probably operating it and why? Right, so simulate 600,000 synthetic satellites and tell me their country of operator and purpose given this constraint. And then you can watch the results stream in to kind of get a sense of the uncertainty in the answer. And so, it turns out that, actually this means I don't know, right? US communications is the most likely, but that's less than 25% likely. Another thing you can ask BaseDB to do is ask it which data entries are probably bogus. Or at least what are ones that are surprising given other variables in the database. Right, so sort of the one experiment I'm curious about for this community would be, what if you could get statisticians or domain experts to look at every field in every EHR you've ever looked at? And rank on a scale of 1 to 100 how likely to be bogus each field is on the basis of the 4 variables that are most relevant for predicting it, or the 400 variables, I don't know, right? You can all do all the above. What fraction of data in your EHRs would survive that screening? I don't know. But that to me is a very interesting data integrity project that you could actually do with an AI. Because it's practical to get the AI to make all those judgment calls. So it turns out here we detect a whole bunch of errors that I won't go into, but we've been reporting them to the public database maintainers for the satellites database. You can also ask BaseDB to help tell you which variables probably predict one another. So here we took a look at the Dartmouth Atlas of Healthcare. And again, I'm only beginning to look at applications in health, so pardon me if I say something very, very, very naive about it. But the version of the database we looked at had 70 operating metrics about hospitals, like measures of cost and capacity, and surveys like congestive heart failure quality score, and total number of Medicare dollars spent per decedent, and things like this, right? And one of the things you find if you ask BaseDB to just make a map of which variables probably predict one another and which don't. Right? So that's what we did up there, is you find these 4 variables are the quality scores, which BaseDB is pretty sure are independent of all the other variables. Which I remember thinking at first was this has got to be a bug, right? But then we started to do some research and we said, oh no, actually this is what was argued by I think it was Gawande and the New Yorker, and this was sort of one of the findings that led to some of the design choices in the Affordable Care Act. Right, so I'm very interested in working with people who actually know something about hospitals and healthcare, because to me, I can't tell if this is a bug or not, right, without doing a lot of research. But probably people in this room, would know how to ask more interesting questions. And you can find hospitals that are very unlikely, right? So you can say which hospitals are deviating from what you would predict based on the characteristics that are measured in the database. So one fun thing you find is that McAllen, Texas has far fewer doctor's visits per decedent than you'd predict based on its other characteristics. And McAllen actually is the hospital that they talk about as the anecdote that carries the narrative in Gawande's article, because they do too many tests and all this other stuff and not enough patient time. Okay, so just to summarize. So what I'm really trying to say from an AI risks and possibilities perspective is that right now, whatever you think the risks and possibilities are, I think they're both a lot greater. Because existing machine learning technology is kind of like data storage was before the database. So just so we remember what that was like, there was I think, distressing article in GQ last summer, which points out that if a police department searches for a gun, that request goes to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, where it is serviced by people scanning microfilm. And that is because of laws that were passed, I think, in the 60s that prevent there from being a computerized database of guns in the US. So the chief in charge of this bureau has reinvented database performance optimization as carried out by probabilistic computing units, namely his staff, to try to optimize the latency and reliability of this bureau. Okay? But we can all recognize this is at least technologically ridiculous. And that's because we're used to the idea that there's this AI software called a database, which you can like easily configure using logic to answer these sorts of questions. So my view is that whatever we think the risks and possibilities of statistical analysis at scale, that branch of AI, are in healthcare, they're far greater because those risks are being identified as if people were doing the searches on microfilm. And efforts like ours, are trying to actually create the AI system which makes this mode of work too inefficient. And maybe there'll be some new capabilities created. So I just want to close by listing 3 kind of projects that have been on my mind since some of them for a while, but that I think I would love to talk more about with people here. So the first is, so with BaseDB, you can take a database and easily make a synthetic database, but that hides variables that BaseDB thinks are probably informative about some sensitive variables. Right, so you can take a database and generate a proxy database that actually tries to hide information that BaseDB could, based on which variables BaseDB thinks might tell you something about a sensitive variable or a set of sensitive variables. So we haven't tested this adversarially yet, but I think this is relevant maybe for compliance with the GPDR. I don't know. I barely know what the GPDR is, but that's a possibility. Next one would be, I'm very interested in understanding what's technologically required to give people more control over their own data, but also the narratives around it. And so that requires giving them control over the variables that are used to code the data, not just somehow the data itself. And I can't go into it now because I'm a little bit over time already, but I think there are ways to integrate BaseDB with the blockchain to build a decentralized data sharing protocol. And then still have the ability to use probabilistic search on top of it to reconcile different viewpoints that disagree about what the relevant variables are. So for people who kind of find that stuff interesting, I'd love to talk more. There are several connections between that and a whole bunch of public interest projects. And then the third is my lab's in the early stages of helping people start to build multivariate maps of poverty, inequality, and some kinds of psychological suffering, at least as evidenced by adverse events to psychotropic drugs and opiate addiction and things like that, especially in rural sections of the country. We're using this as a test case for the geographical layer in BaseDB. And I'm very interested in integrating more data sources, understanding how to think about this, and really how to make the resulting data products useful to help people in disempowered communities empower themselves through advocacy that has an empirical basis. So. Looking forward to talking about that with anybody who's interested. Thank you.
Rakesh, I don't think we have time for questions. Let me, what? Do we? Okay, please.
I was going to ask it offline. I'm not going to go to a mic. Well, I'll just ask it offline. So I haven't stayed up to date with work that's going on at MIT, but what would help me sort of baseline an understanding of what you just said is how does Peter Senge's work integrate with the conversation you just had?
Sorry, Senge or Solovich?
Senge.
Okay, I am not familiar with Peter Senge's work, so we should talk about this offline, at least not by name.
Business school instead of learning organization discipline?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, very interesting. Let me think about that for a minute, but we should talk about that offline.
So I got a relevant question.
Great.
DeepMind signed up with NHS.
Uh-huh.
I'm sure you're familiar with that, right? And then, holy GDPR, they didn't get any patient consent for any of the records that they were doing. Where's the disconnect there?
I'm not sure that's a question for me.
Okay. Second thing, Ingmar Bergman had a great chess playing program in The Seventh Seal, and there's a very famous scene in there where he's playing chess with death. Is that what you're proposing here with healthcare?
One thing I will say is that I think it would be very interesting if we could apply this to, I think it would be very interesting if we could apply this kind of technology to help highlight in the U.S. Some of the systemic dysfunction around care for people who are in the process of dying and make a better case for palliative care.
Thank you.
George Takei had something to say too.
I'm sure Adrian has a question. No, Adrian doesn't have a question really. Adrian, it's Deb asked me to thank Vikesh for this amazing talk, and I want to try and summarize what an amazing day we've had today. To start with Nicholas's, discussion of consent, and how fraught that is as a concept in the world that we're living in healthcare today, and then to close, and maybe you want to get into this, with how much Vikesh's talk is starting to teach us about the real meaning of transparency, which has in healthcare, whether it's policy making or decision support or anything in between. And I think Deb and Amber did an amazing job of putting today's program together to put these two bookends on what we've done. Thank you, Vikesh. Thank you. Last words?
Let me not stand between you guys and the end of your day.
There may be one or two seats left for the gala tonight and more fun, and Amber can help you with that. And so at I think it's at 6, right? 6. We're gonna start with a little fine wine and some bites, and then we'll have, I think, a pretty wonderful evening. For those of you who haven't been to our celebration of privacy galas before, we're very honored again this year to have members of Louis D. Brandeis' family, and there will be 2 grandsons and a great-grandson. No, a great-grandson and great-granddaughter. So there's 4 members of the family this year. It's going to be really quite wonderful, and you'll get to learn more about our Brandeis Award winner, Nicholas Forgo, and we also will have the presentation of the Data Detective Award to Jisoo Yu, and so please, if you're thinking about it, there may be a place or two. We would love for you to join us. So, and we'll see you tomorrow morning, if not tonight. Thank you.